Before you dive into this historical exploration, if you're finding this journey compelling, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'm curious, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Now let's step back in time. You find yourself transported not to a single moment of fiery catastrophe, but to the sprawling sun-baked city of Alexandria nearly 2 millennia ago. You stand amidst the imagined ghosts of intellectual giants, feeling the subtle shift in the air, a faint metallic dustiness clinging to your tongue. You inhale deeply, trying to discern a smell that isn't quite there, yet you feel its presence, the phantom scent of countless narratives, of philosophical treatises, astronomical charts and epic poems, subtly mixed with the acrid, lingering memory of ash. It's the imagined perfume of 1,000,000 burning scrolls, a sorrowful aroma that has permeated humanity's collective memory for centuries. For generations, you've been captivated by a singular, dramatic story, the catastrophic fire that supposedly devoured all of ancient knowledge in one night, erasing centuries of human endeavor. You visualize the roaring inferno, the terrifying crackle of parchment, the utter devastation as unique copies of Aristotle, Euclid, and Sappho turn to smoke. This powerful narrative, so appealing in its tragic simplicity, offers a clear villain and a definitive, heart-wrenching end to an age of unparalleled intellectual achievement. It's a story easily retold, allowing you to mourn a singular, cataclysmic loss. But what if this vivid, romanticized image, this singular moment of loss, is a convenient fiction? Historical records show something far more complex, and in many ways, far more tragic. Ancient sources don't document a single, all-consuming fire that wiped out the main Library of Alexandria in one fell swoop. Contrary to popular belief, the evidence suggests a long, drawn-out decline, a death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single, decisive blow. You begin to understand that the burning wasn't one event, but a series of destructive moments across centuries. It was a gradual erosion of a cultural pillar, punctuated by decreasing imperial support, political instability, shifting cultural priorities, and later, even religious intolerance. You discern that the main library likely declined slowly through reduced funding and a general apathy toward pagan learning as the Roman Empire itself began to wane. The romantic myth of a single, dramatic conflagration where all ancient wisdom vanished in one night is certainly more appealing. It's a narrative that allows you to point to a specific perpetrator, to blame Caesar or some other singular villain, but the reality you uncover is messier, more nuanced, and ultimately more profoundly human. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in one dramatic blaze. It withered, it fractured, it slowly faded over time, a prolonged intellectual twilight, rather than a sudden violent night. It was a civilization slowly, painfully, losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. This gradual, systemic loss, rather than a single, fiery event, presents a different kind of tragedy. You're left to ponder not just the physical destruction, but the slow, quiet abandonment of accumulated knowledge. It forces you to wonder, what unique insights are being neglected in your own time? What will future generations mourn that you let slip away, not with a dramatic blaze, but with a whisper of indifference and neglect? You can almost hear it now, the echo of that perfect lie, that single, captivating story of a grand library consumed by a sudden, devastating fire. It's the narrative you've grown up with, a dramatic, singular tragedy that neatly packages the loss of unimaginable knowledge. You picture Julius Caesar, locked in a desperate struggle in 48 BCE, his ships ablaze in Alexandria's bustling harbour, the flames leaping, consuming not just the naval fleet, but the very heart of human wisdom. You imagine the smoke billowing over the legendary Mouseion, the grand complex housing the main library, watching as generations of scholarship turn to ash. It's a compelling image, but it's only a sliver of the truth, often misinterpreted. Historical records show that Caesar's fire did indeed spread from his burning ships, engulfing port warehouses and potentially a significant number of scrolls stored there. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Ammianus Marcellinus document this military collateral damage. You can almost feel the heat radiating from those burning docks, smell the oil and wood smoke carried on the Mediterranean breeze, and hear the frantic shouts of soldiers and citizens alike as the conflagration rages. Yet, what these sources conspicuously don't confirm is that this particular blaze reached, let alone destroyed, the main Library of Alexandria itself, that colossal repository of knowledge within the Mouseion. The evidence suggests a more resilient institution, at least initially. Consider Strabo, the renowned geographer who visited Alexandria just 30 years after Caesar's campaign. He described a vibrant scholarly community, complete with an active Mouseion that, while perhaps diminished from its zenith, was still a centre of learning. This contemporary account makes it clear the main library did not vanish in a single cataclysmic inferno under Caesar's watch. You begin to understand that the grand institution likely survived this skirmish, its flame of scholarship flickering but not extinguished. Its subsequent decline was a far slower, more insidious process, chipped away by decreasing imperial support, shifting intellectual priorities, and the empire's gradual erosion. The next truly documented, deliberate act of destruction arrives centuries later, in 391 CE. This time, the target wasn't the main library, which had likely already dwindled significantly, but its renowned daughter library, the Serapeum. You can almost feel the fervent energy, the religious zealotry of the Christian mobs, led by Patriarch Theophilus, as they descend upon this magnificent temple library. This wasn't an accident of war. This was a deliberate campaign against pagan learning and symbols. Ancient accounts vividly describe the smashing of idols, the tearing down of statues, and the destruction of the scrolls within. The physical ruin of the Serapeum is a well-documented historical fact, a chilling testament to religious intolerance directly impacting the preservation of knowledge. You sense the stark difference here, not a military mishap, but a purposeful eradication, driven by belief. This journey through history reveals a truth more nuanced and perhaps more profoundly sobering than the singular myth. The Library of Alexandria didn't suffer one dramatic fire. It endured a series of destructive forces and a prolonged decline. You realize that there isn't a single villain, but rather a complex interplay of accidental military damage, deliberate religious persecution, and the slow, quiet abandonment that comes with dwindling resources and shifting cultural values. It makes you reflect. The loss of knowledge, in its most devastating form, isn't always a spectacular tragedy. Sometimes it's the quiet fading, the gradual erosion, that truly robs humanity of its past. You walk through what remains of the sprawling complex, not a ruin of twisted metal and charred stone from a single fire, but an uncomfortable silence where vibrant intellectual life once thrived. You feel the dust settling on empty shelves, run your fingers over cold, smooth surfaces that once held countless papyrus scrolls. It's not the scent of burning you perceive now, but the faint, stale odour of damp decay, the quiet whisper of things long gone, the uncomfortable silence of missing pages. This is the true aftermath of the library's decline, an absence so profound it almost hums. you try to grasp the sheer scale of what vanished. Ancient estimates suggest the Library of Alexandria housed anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Imagine that volume. You picture mountains of written wisdom, works of philosophy that shaped Western thought, groundbreaking mathematics, astronomical calculations mapping the cosmos, intricate medical procedures, vast histories of nations, and the lyrical masterpieces of literature. Texts by Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Sophocles, Sappho, not just their names, but their actual thoughts, their unique insights, meticulously copied and preserved. These weren't mere copies of works available elsewhere. Many were unique, singular artifacts of human genius, existing only within these hallowed walls. Contrary to the popular image of a singular, dramatic conflagration, the evidence suggests a more agonizing fate for much of this treasure. These invaluable works didn't always burn in roaring flames. You realize they often simply rotted from neglect, forgotten in damp storerooms as funding dwindled and skilled librarians became scarce. They were discarded as pagan, learning by a new ascendant Christian culture, deemed irrelevant or even dangerous to evolving theological priorities, or perhaps most tragically, they were simply lost as scribes stopped copying them, allowing the delicate papyrus to disintegrate, taking with it the collective wisdom of centuries. The burning wasn't a single event. It was a civilization slowly losing interest in preserving its own wisdom, allowing its past to silently crumble into dust. The cultural impact of this gradual decline is almost unfathomable. It wasn't just individual texts that disappeared, but entire fields of accumulated knowledge. You ponder the astronomical calculations that could have accelerated our understanding of the universe, the medical procedures that might have saved countless lives, the mathematical proofs that could have unlocked new technologies, the historical accounts that offered unparalleled insights into ancient civilizations, the philosophical insights that might have guided ethical progress, and literary masterpieces that would have enriched human empathy. Much of this was permanently lost, setting human knowledge back centuries, creating an intellectual void you can almost feel in the quiet air around you. Some Alexandria texts, thankfully, survived through copies in other great libraries, travelling to places like Constantinople or being painstakingly translated into Arabic by diligent Islamic scholars. The Byzantine Empire maintained some works, and the European Renaissance would later rediscover others, sparking a renewed thirst for classical knowledge. But you'll never know the full extent of what was permanently lost. Those unique copies, those groundbreaking works never duplicated, those insights forever silenced. You realize that the true tragedy isn't just the destruction, but the uncomfortable, irretrievable silence of all those missing pages. It's a silence that still echoes, reminding you of the fragile nature of knowledge and the profound cost of its neglect. You trace the jagged edges of historical accounts, like peeling back layers of old scar tissue, revealing not a single clean wound, but a complex tapestry of forces that contributed to the library's demise. You begin to understand that the question of who burned the library has no simple answer, because, in truth, many hands played a part, and sometimes no hands at all. First, you revisit the shadow of Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE. The popular narrative often casts him as the primary culprit, a Roman general inadvertently destroying the world's knowledge in a military skirmish. Historical records show that during his campaign against Ptolemy XIII, Caesar did indeed ignite a fire that spread from his ships in the harbour, burning naval arsenals and some storage facilities. You can almost feel the chaos, the desperate struggle as flames lick at the valuable goods and documents stored near the docks. But ancient sources document this as accidental military collateral damage, and crucially, they don't confirm it reached the main Mouseion library. The evidence suggests that if scrolls were lost here, they were primarily those stored in warehouses, not the core collection. This was a tragedy of war, perhaps, but not the deliberate intellectual arson often imagined. Then, centuries later, you witness a different kind of destruction, deliberate and fervent. In 391 CE, under the Christian patriarch Theophilus, you feel the tide turn. Christian hostility toward pagan learning reached a boiling point. The Serapeum, that magnificent daughter library and temple to Serapis, became a target. This destruction is well documented. You can almost hear the shouts of the Christian mobs, see them tearing down statues, smashing pagan symbols, and systematically destroying the library's contents. This was not accidental. This was deliberate religious persecution, an ideological cleansing meant to eradicate the old ways. It marks a profound cultural shift away from pagan Greek learning toward Christian theology, where much of the ancient wisdom was deemed anathema. But perhaps the most insidious cause isn't a dramatic, fiery event at all, but a slow, quiet bleeding. As the Roman Empire declined, so did its support for institutions like the library. You perceive a gradual withdrawal of funding, a decrease in scholarly patronage. The scrolls, fragile papyrus in a humid climate, demanded constant care, copying, and restoration. Without dedicated resources, they began to rot from neglect, becoming fodder for insects, simply disintegrating into dust. This imperial neglect, coupled with a changing cultural landscape where the intellectual elite's interest shifted, contributed more to the loss than any single blaze. The burning here wasn't flames, but the slow, corrosive acid of apathy. Finally, you confront the most persistent myth, the story of Caliph Omar ordering the library burned during the Arab conquest in 641 CE, famously stating that if the books contradicted the Quran, they were heretical, and if they agreed, they were superfluous. This captivating tale provides another clear villain, easily slotting into a narrative of cultural clash. However, modern scholarship largely exonerates the Arabs. Historical records show this story first appears 600 years after the event, making it highly disputed and likely mythological. By 641 CE, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense, was already long gone, a shadow of its former glory. Why do we cling so tightly to the idea of a single monumental blaze? You realize it's simpler, more tragic, allowing you to blame one villain, be it Caesar, the Christians, or the Arabs, depending on your bias or the narrative you wish to construct. Reality is far messier, revealing that civilizations often lose their libraries not just through arson, but through a gradual, heartbreaking indifference. The slow decline is a more sobering, yet arguably more profound tragedy than a dramatic conflagration. It's a reflection on humanity's capacity to simply stop caring about preserving its own hard-won wisdom. You stand on the muddy banks of the Nile Delta, feeling the wet slap of papyrus reeds against your legs, the warm, humid air thick with the scent of fertile earth and ancient possibility. This is where it all began, where the very medium of knowledge was born, destined to hold the wisdom of a burgeoning world. You look out over the slow-moving river, imagining the boats laden with precious papyrus scrolls making their way to Alexandria, the cultural heart of the Hellenistic world. In its prime, the library was more than just a building. It was a beacon, a magnet for the greatest minds of its age. You picture scholars from across the known world converging here, debating, researching, and painstakingly copying texts, transforming Alexandria into an unparalleled intellectual powerhouse. The ambition of its founders, the Ptolemaic pharaohs, was staggering. They sought to collect every book in the world, literally. You can feel their drive, their hunger for knowledge, as they established not just the library, but the Mouseion, a research institute, a university, a home for scholars who would live and work under royal patronage. This wasn't merely a storage facility, it was a living, breathing centre of intellectual endeavour. You see the scribes working under flickering lamplight, hear the murmur of philosophers in deep discussion, feel the excitement of astronomers charting the stars. The library housed a staggering collection. Ancient estimates vary, but you grasp the enormity of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, each one a precious vessel of human thought. These scrolls contain not just stories, but the very foundations of Western civilization. You imagine the tactile sensation of unrolling a papyrus containing Euclid's Elements, laying out the principles of geometry that still underpin engineering and architecture today. You envision deciphering astronomical calculations that predicted eclipses, sophisticated medical texts describing procedures centuries ahead of their time, and philosophical treatises by the likes of Plato and Aristotle, shaping the very way you understand ethics and governance. Here were the epic poems of Homer, the tragedies of Sophocles, the lyrical verses of Sappho, not in dusty academic editions, but as living works, actively studied, debated, and preserved. These were not just records, they were the engines of discovery and understanding. The library's reach wasn't confined to Greek thought, it was a universal repository. You sense the sheer diversity of knowledge, drawn from Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond, a truly global effort to gather and synthesize human learning. You comprehend that this was a place where knowledge was not just stored, but created. It was where Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, where Aristarchus first proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, and where Herophilus conducted groundbreaking anatomical research. This was a place of innovation, a hub, where the very boundaries of human understanding were pushed forward, generation after generation. But as you contemplate this magnificent achievement, a sense of unease creeps in. You realize that this grand vision, this unparalleled accumulation of wisdom, was inherently fragile. The very nature of papyrus, susceptible to humidity, fire, and decay, meant constant effort was required for its preservation. The political patronage that created it could also be withdrawn. The cultural unity that supported its universal quest for knowledge could fracture. You feel a subtle shift in the air, a premonition that even the most monumental human achievements are not immune to the relentless currents of time, war, and changing values. The potential for loss, even amidst such greatness, looms large. You hear it now, the faint, rhythmic scratch of a scribe's calamus against papyrus, a sound of tireless dedication resonating across centuries. It's the sound of knowledge being saved, one careful stroke at a time, echoing through the halls of other great libraries that would, in time, become the inheritors of Alexandria's scattered legacy. For all the talk of destruction and loss, it's crucial to acknowledge that not everything vanished. Some Alexandria texts, thankfully, survived, a testament to the persistent human drive to preserve and transmit wisdom. You realize that the Library of Alexandria didn't exist in a vacuum. It was the largest, the most famous, but not the only repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Many pivotal works were already duplicated, copies existing in other libraries across the Hellenistic and later the Roman world. You imagine these scrolls travelling, sometimes on merchant ships, sometimes carried by scholars fleeing persecution, finding new homes in places like Pergamum, Athens, or later Constantinople. When the calamities struck Alexandria, whether Caesar's accidental fire, the Christian destruction of the Serapeum, or the slow rot of imperial neglect, these duplicated texts offered a lifeline, a chance for certain pieces of ancient thought to endure. Centuries later, as Europe entered its own era of intellectual darkness, you witness another crucial period of preservation. You see the diligent hands of Islamic scholars working tirelessly in their own burgeoning centers of learning, like Baghdad. They actively sought out and preserved Greek texts, not merely storing them, but translating them into Arabic, engaging with them, and building upon them. You feel the intellectual hunger of these scholars, bridging a chasm of lost knowledge, ensuring that the insights of Aristotle, Euclid, and Hippocrates would not be forgotten, but would instead fuel a new golden age of scientific and philosophical inquiry. This was not a passive act. It was a deliberate, monumental effort of cultural transmission that directly impacted the trajectory of human understanding. Simultaneously, you find Byzantine scholars in the Eastern Roman Empire maintaining their own vibrant traditions of classical learning. They kept alive many Greek works, copying and recopying them in scriptoria, safeguarding a significant portion of ancient literature and philosophy. You perceive the long, unbroken chain of scholarship, often unnoticed in the dramatic narratives of destruction, quietly working to ensure continuity. Then much later you see the European Renaissance unfold, a period characterized by a fervent rediscovery of classical texts. Many works that had been preserved in Byzantine or Islamic libraries found their way back to the West, sparking intellectual revolutions in art, science, and philosophy. You feel the thrill of these rediscoveries, the sense of a lost inheritance being reclaimed, breathing new life into dormant ideas. Yet, despite these valiant efforts, you also feel the poignant weight of what was permanently lost. You remember those estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, and you know that not all of them had duplicates. We'll never truly know what unique copies, what singular works, what profound insights were contained in those scrolls that simply rotted away, or were discarded as irrelevant, or became fuel for an opportunistic fire. That is the haunting reality. The endless scratch of the scribe's calamus saved much, but it could not save everything. And this leaves you with a profound question. What knowledge are you, in your own time, failing to preserve? What cultural treasures? What vital information? What unique insights are being allowed to slip away through neglect, indifference, or the dramatic shifts of your own era? The echoes of Alexandria remind you that preservation is not a passive act, but an active, ongoing responsibility. You step into the echoing emptiness where once, you imagine, the air vibrated with 1,000 intellectual currents. You hear it not with your ears, but in the mind's eye. The hum of a dozen languages swirling in a single hall, the fervent whispers of Greek philosophers, the crisp pronouncements of Egyptian priests, the measured tones of Persian astronomers, and the subtle inflections of Hebrew scholars. This symphony of intellect, this vibrant cross-pollination of ideas, was the true heartbeat of Alexandria. When the library declined, the loss wasn't just scrolls turning to dust. It was the silencing of this hum, the breaking of a dynamic intellectual conversation that had spanned centuries and continents. You comprehend that the cultural impact of this gradual decline, this prolonged abandonment, was immense. It wasn't simply the absence of specific texts. It was the erosion of accumulated knowledge, the loss of entire fields of study built on meticulous research and peer review. Imagine astronomical calculations so precise they could predict eclipses for centuries, now lost, forcing future generations to start almost from scratch. You visualize complex medical procedures based on centuries of anatomical observation and practical application, disappearing, leaving physicians to fumble in the dark for cures that had once been known. Mathematical proofs, which could have accelerated technological and scientific progress by millennia, simply ceased to exist, requiring arduous rediscovery. The historical accounts, the philosophical insights, the literary masterpieces, these were not merely pleasant diversions. They were the narratives that shaped identity, the ethical frameworks that guided societies, and the creative expressions that spoke to the deepest parts of the human condition. When unique copies of Sophocles or Sappho withered from neglect, it wasn't just a poem lost, it was a voice silenced, a window into a specific human experience closed forever. You feel the weight of this void, the undeniable sense that you are missing pieces of your own intellectual heritage, profound insights that would have enriched your understanding of the world and yourself. The evidence suggests that while some knowledge survived through copies in other distant libraries, like those in Constantinople or Baghdad, much was permanently lost. You realize that what was preserved was often a fraction, sometimes a lucky accident, rather than a systematic transfer of the entire Alexandrian corpus. You can almost feel the frustrating gaps, the broken intellectual lineages. While Islamic scholars and, much later, the European Renaissance would rediscover and translate many Greek texts, sparking new eras of enlightenment, you are acutely aware that their efforts were built on what remained, not on the entirety of what had been. This protracted loss, rather than a singular dramatic event, profoundly sets human knowledge back by centuries. You sense the intellectual dark ages that followed, a period where fundamental questions, once thoroughly explored, had to be painfully re-examined. The momentum of ancient inquiry, that vibrant hum of a dozen languages, dissipated. It forces you to confront a sobering truth. The intellectual progress of humanity is not a continuous, upward ascent. It is fragile, susceptible to shifts in cultural priorities, political instability, and the quiet, insidious creep of indifference. The real tragedy is not just a building burning, but a civilization collectively forgetting to care about the preservation of its own hard-won wisdom, leaving you to wonder what other precious hums might be fading around you today. You feel it now, a pressure behind your eyes, the metaphorical weight of every question ever asked but never answered, every theory left untested, every discovery cut short. This isn't the physical burden of countless scrolls, but the immense, intangible cost of intellectual stagnation, the true legacy of Alexandria's decline. You realize that the narrative of a single, dramatic fire, while compelling, allows you to simplify a far more complex and sobering reality. It lets you outsource the blame to one moment, one villain, rather than confronting the uncomfortable truth of gradual abandonment and systemic failure. The romantic myth is appealing because it's clear. It offers a definitive moment of loss, a single historical scar. But the sobering historical reality reveals a tapestry woven with multiple destructive threads across centuries. You've traced the timeline: Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, which historical records show likely burned harbour warehouses, not the main Mouseion library itself. Strabo, visiting Alexandria only 30 years later, documented a functioning scholarly community, suggesting the main library persevered. This was collateral damage from war, not intentional intellectual arson. Then you witnessed the well-documented Christian destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate religious persecution, a direct assault on pagan learning, driven by a cultural shift away from Greek philosophy toward Christian theology. Here, you feel the tangible force of intolerance, the deliberate silencing of dissenting voices and worldviews. But perhaps the greatest culprit was not fire or zealotry, but something far more insidious: neglect. You sense the slow bleed as decreasing imperial support under later Roman emperors starved the library of funds. The humid Egyptian climate, hostile to fragile papyrus scrolls, demanded constant, costly care, copying, and restoration. As interest waned and resources dried up, the scrolls didn't burn in dramatic flames. They rotted from damp, were devoured by insects, discarded as pagan relics, or simply lost as scribes stopped copying them. The main library likely died a slow, agonizing death from apathy, a civilization gradually losing interest in preserving its own accumulated wisdom. And finally, you consider the persistent story of Caliph Omar burning the library during the Arab conquest in 641 CE. You recognize this as a largely mythological account. Historical records show this tale first appears 600 years later and is considered fabricated. By the time of the Arab conquest, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful form, was already long gone, a shadow of its former glory. Modern scholarship largely exonerates the Arabs from this particular act of destruction, so why do we prefer the dramatic single-fire story? You realize it's simpler. It allows you to blame one clear villain, be it Caesar, the Christians, or the Arabs, depending on one's own biases, for a monumental loss. The reality is messier, more complex, and in its gradual erosion, far more tragic. Civilizations often lose their libraries through apathy, through a collective failure to value their intellectual inheritance, rather than just through spectacular arson. This gradual decline is a far more sobering reflection on the human condition. The Library of Alexandria wasn't killed in one night by one fire. It died slowly as a civilization across many centuries stopped caring about preserving its knowledge. That's the real tragedy, not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And this profound reflection leads you to a piercing question for your own time. What knowledge are you, collectively, failing to preserve today? What will future generations mourn that you let slip away, not in a blaze, but through neglect, indifference, or the simple act of looking away? You feel the weight of that question, heavy and resonant. You feel it now, the gritty bite of desert dust on your tongue, not from the sands of ancient Alexandria, but from the dry, lingering taste of historical ambiguity. It's the sensation of wrestling with fragmented evidence, the challenge of discerning truth from popular myth, and the profound realization that the real reason the Library of Alexandria burned is not a singular event, but a confluence of destructive forces and a heartbreaking lack of stewardship across centuries. This complex reality stands in stark contrast to the romanticized narrative you've likely carried for so long. Whether its eventual fate was sealed by fire, religious zealotry, prolonged neglect, or a tragic combination of all these elements, across multiple epochs, the loss of the Library of Alexandria represents one of history's great intellectual tragedies. You reflect on the magnitude of what disappeared, not just books, but entire methodologies, accumulated insights, and the very spirit of unbounded inquiry. It's a loss that echoes through the annals of human progress, a silent testament to the fragility of civilization's collective memory. The initial tremor of destruction, you recall, came with Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE. You visualize the strategic necessity of his actions, the desperation of military conflict leading to flames engulfing harbour warehouses. The historical records show this as an accident of war, a tragic consequence of conflict, but they don't confirm it reached the main Mouseion library. It was a wound, perhaps, but not the fatal blow often imagined. Then, centuries later, you perceive the deliberate ideological assault. In 391 CE, under the zealous hand of Christian patriarch Theophilus, the Serapeum, a magnificent daughter library, was systematically destroyed. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of religious persecution against pagan learning, a fervent desire to erase a competing worldview. You sense the tangible shift, the chilling certainty of intellectual intolerance. Yet perhaps the most profound culprit was the slow, insidious creep of imperial neglect. As the Roman Empire declined, its financial support for the grand institutions of Alexandria dwindled. The constant care needed for papyrus scrolls in a humid climate, copying, cataloguing, repairing, became an unsustainable burden. You feel the slow decay, the quiet rot of abandonment, as scrolls turned to dust, became insect fodder, or were simply discarded as cultural priorities shifted away from classical pagan learning. The main library likely withered this way, a slow death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single dramatic conflagration. And the dramatic tale of Caliph Omar's fiery decree in 641 CE? You now understand this as largely mythological, a story emerging centuries later, likely to fit a particular political or religious narrative. By that time, the Great Library was already a ghost of its former self, its intellectual light long dimmed. The true reason the library burned, or rather faded, is multiple reasons across centuries. The accidental fires of war, the deliberate purges of religious zealotry, and perhaps most tellingly, the slow, corrosive acid of apathy. It was a civilization, over generations, failing to value and actively preserve its own accumulated wisdom. You feel the profound weight of this lesson, and this leads you to the inescapable, uncomfortable question for your own time. What knowledge are you failing to preserve today? What vital information, what unique cultural expressions, what essential insights are you allowing to slip away through neglect, indifference, or the dramatic shifts of the modern world? The echoes of Alexandria are not just a historical warning, they are a timeless question, urging you to consider your own responsibility in safeguarding the intellectual inheritance of humanity. The grit of desert dust reminds you that even the most monumental achievements are fragile, requiring constant vigilance and care to endure. You feel the dry wind whip around you, carrying not the scent of immediate fire, but the distinct, almost bitter taste of human struggle. The agony of measuring the world with a stick and a shadow, time and again, when the answers were once readily available. You grasp the profound irony. Eratosthenes, a scholar of the library, precisely calculated Earth's circumference using just such simple tools, his methods and results enshrined within its walls. When that knowledge faded, future generations would have to embark on that arduous journey of rediscovery, decades, even centuries, lost to the void where scrolls once lay. This painful repetition, this intellectual backtracking, is the true consequence of Alexandria's complex demise. The romanticized myth of a single, catastrophic blaze, wiping out all ancient knowledge in one dramatic night, holds a powerful grip on your imagination. It's a simple, tragic narrative that allows for easy blame, often pointing to Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE. But as you've seen, historical records show that while Caesar's military actions did lead to fires in Alexandria's harbour warehouses, ancient sources like Strabo confirm a functioning library and scholarly community decades later. The main Mouseion library was not confirmed to have burned then. This was a tremor, not the earthquake. The next documented deliberate act of destruction arrived centuries later in 391 CE. You feel the force of religious fervour as Christian mobs under Patriarch Theophilus systematically destroyed the Serapeum, the library's esteemed daughter institution. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate purge of pagan learning, a cultural shift driven by intense religious intolerance. You understand this as a critical blow, certainly, yet still not the singular, all-encompassing fire of legend. But the most insidious killer of the library was far less dramatic: apathy and neglect. You perceived the slow, corrosive effect of decreasing imperial support under later Roman emperors. The vast collection of papyrus scrolls, vulnerable to humidity, insects, and decay, required immense resources for continuous copying, maintenance, and preservation. As funding dwindled and cultural priorities shifted away from pagan Greek scholarship toward Christian theology, the scrolls didn't burn in flames. They rotted from neglect, were discarded as irrelevant, or simply ceased to be copied. The burning wasn't one event, but a civilization slowly losing interest in preserving its own hard-won wisdom, allowing it to crumble into dust. And the persistent story of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE during the Arab conquest? Modern scholarship, analysing Arab historians and other ancient sources, largely considers this a fabricated tale, appearing 600 years after the fact. By the time of the Arab conquest, any meaningful institution known as the Library of Alexandria was already a shadow of its former self, if it existed at all. Ultimately, the real reason the Library of Alexandria burned is multifaceted. Accidental fires of war, deliberate acts of religious zealotry, profound political instability, and most tragically, centuries of gradual neglect. This slow, agonizing death of knowledge, rather than a single dramatic conflagration, is the sobering historical reality. It's a testament to the fragility of human achievement and the constant vigilance required to preserve it. You are left with a powerful, echoing question. What invaluable knowledge are you, in your own time, allowing to slip away through neglect, indifference, or a simple failure to care? What stick and shadow measurements will future generations have to repeat because you let the lessons of the past turn to dust? You stand on the bustling docks of ancient Alexandria, the overpowering aroma of spices, frankincense from Arabia, cinnamon from India, mingling with the sharp tang of Mediterranean salt and the honest sweat of labourers. You hear the creak of rigging, the shouts of merchants in a dozen languages, the rhythmic splash of oars. This vibrant sensory explosion is a potent reminder of what Alexandria was, a nexus of global trade, a melting pot of cultures, and precisely because of this, the ideal home for a library that sought to collect the entire world's knowledge. This city wasn't just a physical place, it was an idea, a confluence of human endeavour, yet even in its overwhelming dynamism, it harboured the seeds of its own decline. You've explored the complex, nuanced reality of the library's end, dispelling the romanticised myth of a single, catastrophic blaze. But why does that myth persist? Why do we, as humans, cling to the dramatic image of a singular inferno rather than the sobering truth of gradual erosion? You realise it's simpler, cleaner. It allows you to point a finger to assign blame to one villain, whether it's Julius Caesar, the Christians, or the Arabs. This dramatic narrative fits neatly into the human desire for a definitive conclusion, a clear beginning and end to such a monumental tragedy. Historical records show a far more intricate, drawn-out process. You recall Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, an accidental military action that burned harbour warehouses, perhaps some stored scrolls, but ancient sources document that the main Mouseion library survived, functioning decades later. This was not the library's end. Then you perceive the undeniable religious zealotry of 391 CE, when Christian mobs, under Patriarch Theophilus, deliberately destroyed the Serapeum Daughter Library. This was a direct, targeted act of intellectual destruction driven by a profound cultural and ideological shift away from pagan learning. You feel the chilling difference, one an accident of war, the other a deliberate act of intolerance. Yet perhaps the most pervasive and tragic cause was not fire or direct attack, but the slow, insidious creep of neglect and dwindling support. The evidence suggests that as the Roman Empire declined, so did the imperial patronage and funding for the library. The colossal collection, housed on fragile papyrus scrolls, demanded constant, expensive upkeep, copying, and cataloguing. You sense the gradual abandonment, the quiet rot from humidity, insects, and disinterest, as a civilization slowly stopped valuing its own accumulated wisdom. The burning here wasn't flames, but the silent, corrosive acid of apathy, dissolving centuries of thought. And the persistent tale of Caliph Omar burning the library during the Arab conquest in 641 CE. As you've learned, that story, appearing 600 years after the fact, is largely considered mythological by modern scholarship. By then, the Library of Alexandria was already effectively gone, a ghost haunting the city's intellectual memory. You realize that the tragic convenience of the single fire myth masks a more profound and uncomfortable truth. The library didn't die in one dramatic night, but slowly, across centuries, through a combination of political instability, changing cultural priorities, religious intolerance, and perhaps most painfully, the gradual failure of humanity to care enough to preserve its own greatest intellectual treasure. That grit of desert dust on a scholar's tongue becomes a metaphor for the difficult, messy truth of history, reminding you that great works, like great cities, are sustained not just by brilliance, but by diligent, continuous effort. You taste the bitter tang of ambition and the sweetness of vast wealth on your tongue, the very flavors that built Alexandria, a city whose very existence was rooted in the fertile bounty of the Nile and its strategic position in trade. Here, grain was currency, and ideas were an even rarer commodity, meticulously collected and guarded. You've walked through the echoes of this intellectual powerhouse, and now, as this journey concludes, you stand with a clearer understanding of its end, dispelling the popular myth of a single catastrophic burning. The romanticized tale of a singular, all-consuming fire wiping out centuries of human knowledge in one dramatic night is undeniably compelling. It provides a simple narrative for an incomprehensible loss, allowing you to mourn a definitive, tragic event. But contrary to this widespread belief, historical records reveal a far more nuanced and ultimately more agonizing reality. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in one dramatic blaze, but suffered a gradual decline and multiple destructive blows across centuries. You realize the burning wasn't a singular event, but a civilization slowly losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. You remember the distant rumble of Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, an accidental conflagration that affected harbour warehouses, perhaps some stored scrolls, but ancient sources document that the main Mouseion library survived, functioning decades later. This was not the library's end. You recall the fervent, deliberate destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE by Christian mobs under Patriarch Theophilus, a clear act of religious intolerance against pagan learning. But perhaps the most pervasive and tragic cause was the silent, insidious creep of neglect. As empires waned and cultural priorities shifted, the library faced decreasing imperial support, its fragile papyrus scrolls demanding constant care, copying and humid storage, slowly rotted from abandonment. This was the quiet attrition, the slow death by 1,000 cuts, more devastating than any single flame. The story of Caliph Omar in 641 CE, you now know, is largely a fabrication, appearing centuries after the library was effectively gone. So why do we perpetuate the myth? You realize it's simpler, more convenient. A single villain, a single tragic knight, offers a tidier explanation than the complex interplay of war, religious zealotry, political instability, and, most profoundly, human apathy. The reality, messier and more unsettling, reveals that civilizations lose their libraries not always through dramatic arson, but often through a gradual failure to value and maintain their own intellectual heritage. This slow, gradual decline is a more sobering reflection on the human condition. The cultural impact of this complex destruction is immeasurable. It wasn't just scrolls of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature that vanished. It was the unique copies, the groundbreaking insights, the pathways of thought that were permanently lost, setting human knowledge back centuries. Some texts survived through copies in other libraries, nurtured by Islamic and Byzantine scholars, later rediscovered during the Renaissance. But we will never know the full extent of what slipped away forever. Whether its end came from accidental fire, deliberate zealotry, or prolonged neglect, the Library of Alexandria's loss represents one of history's great intellectual tragedies. The real reason it burned. Multiple reasons across centuries: war, religion, apathy, and civilization's failure to value its own accumulated wisdom. You feel the profound weight of this truth. The library wasn't killed in one night by one fire. It died slowly as a civilization stopped caring about preserving knowledge. That's the real tragedy. Not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And it raises a critical question for you today. What knowledge are we failing to preserve in our own time? What will future generations mourn that we let slip away through neglect, lost not in a blaze, but in the quiet, insidious silence of indifference? You stand before the imagined ruins of the Serapeum, feeling the cold stone under your fingertips even on a summer's day. It's a chill that emanates not from the weather, but from the deliberate act of destruction it witnessed. This magnificent daughter library, once a beacon of knowledge and a testament to the syncretic blend of Egyptian and Greek culture, met a definitive, violent end. Unlike the main library's slow decay, the Serapeum's fate in 391 CE provides you with a stark, tangible example of knowledge being systematically eradicated by human hands driven by fervent belief. This was no accidental fire, no mere collateral damage of war. Historical records document, with chilling clarity, the events orchestrated by Christian patriarch Theophilus. You can almost hear the shouts of the Christian mobs, feel the tremor of their righteous indignation as they stormed this revered temple library. This was a deliberate assault on paganism, a targeted campaign to dismantle its symbols and intellectual foundations. The cold stone under your hand seems to hum with the echoes of sledgehammers against statues, the tearing of precious scrolls, the systematic dismantling of a cultural heritage deemed heretical. The Serapeum's destruction highlights a critical phase in the decline of Alexandrian learning, the clash between ancient pagan philosophy and the ascendant power of Christian theology. You realize this wasn't just about destroying books, it was about shifting cultural priorities, about replacing one intellectual paradigm with another. The classical Greek works, once universally celebrated, were increasingly viewed as dangerous or irrelevant in a world rapidly embracing a new religious worldview. The scrolls within the Serapeum were not merely physical objects, they were symbols of a fading era, targeted for deliberate obliteration. This event is well documented by ancient sources, unlike some of the more ambiguous accounts surrounding the main library's fate. You see the certainty in the historical evidence, This was a planned, executed act of intellectual suppression. It offers a powerful, albeit painful, illustration of how religious intolerance can directly lead to the permanent loss of knowledge. The chilling efficiency of this destruction serves as a potent counterpoint to the romanticized notion of a single, accidental fire. You consider the irony. While the main library likely withered from neglect, the Serapeum suffered a violent, decisive end. One died slowly, quietly, almost forgotten. The other was murdered with fervent intent. Both outcomes contributed to the vast chasm of lost knowledge. The cold stone reminds you that knowledge is not just vulnerable to physical destruction, but also to ideological shifts, to the human tendency to deem certain truths inconvenient or dangerous. The loss here was not only texts, but the diversity of thought, the alternative perspectives that a pluralistic intellectual environment once fostered. You feel the gravity of this loss, a stark testament to the human capacity for both creation and profound destruction. You feel the cool, imposing shadow of a colossal statue fall over you, its ancient eyes staring out, impassive, across the temple grounds of the Serapeum. This was the mighty Serapis, a deity born of Greek and Egyptian traditions who, in this sacred precinct, also became a silent guardian of knowledge. The Serapeum was more than just a temple. It was a renowned daughter library, a secondary repository to the great Mouseion, and its very existence blurred the lines between spiritual devotion and intellectual pursuit. You sense the reverence here, the quiet dignity of a place where both divine wisdom and human scholarship were held in high esteem. But this guardianship, even under a god, proved tragically vulnerable. In 391 CE, this sanctuary of blended faith and erudition met a definitive, violent end, an event starkly contrasting the murky accounts of other alleged destructions. You recall the historical records, well documented by ancient sources, that paint a vivid picture of what transpired. This was no accidental fire, no military collateral damage. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign orchestrated by Christian patriarch Theophilus. You almost hear the escalating fervor, the relentless chants of the Christian mobs. You feel the tremor in the ground as they descended upon the Serapeum, their zeal directed at what they perceived as the very heart of pagan idolatry and learning. You witness, in your mind's eye, not scholars fleeing flames, but the deliberate smashing of the statue of Serapis, the systematic tearing down of temple walls, and the calculated destruction of the scrolls within. This was an act of profound ideological cleansing, a direct assault on a competing worldview. The cold stone beneath your feet seems to remember the force of their conviction, the chilling efficiency with which they erased a cultural pillar. This event marks a crucial turning point, a visible scar on the timeline of Alexandria's decline. It highlights the potent, destructive power of religious intolerance and the dramatic shift in cultural priorities from pagan Greek philosophy towards an ascendant Christian theology. The texts held within the Serapeum, once cherished, were now deemed anathema, symbols of an old order to be eradicated. You realize that here, the burning of knowledge was undeniably a deliberate act, a conscious decision to silence a particular form of wisdom. Yet even this significant act of destruction, though stark and undeniable, was still just one thread in the complex tapestry of the library's demise. It wasn't the singular, all-encompassing inferno of popular myth that wiped out all of ancient knowledge. Instead, it was a pivotal blow, confirming the vulnerability of intellectual heritage when confronted by profound societal shifts and unwavering ideological fervor. You are left to ponder how even knowledge, guarded by a god, within walls of sacred stone, can be brought to ruin by the powerful, often turbulent currents of human belief and will. It reminds you that the preservation of wisdom requires more than just a protective deity. It demands continuous human commitment. You stand at the edge of the ancient Alexandrian harbour, the sharp sting of salt and smoke still lingering in the air, thousands of years after the fact. It's the phantom sensation of Julius Caesar's infamous fire in 48 BCE, an event often pinned as the singular catastrophic moment that erased the Library of Alexandria. You can almost feel the chaotic energy, hear the shouts, and witness the desperate struggle as flames, ignited during Caesar's military campaign against Ptolemy XIII, spread through the bustling docks. This is where the romantic myth of a single, all-consuming blaze often takes root, painting a dramatic, albeit incomplete, picture. Historical records show that Caesar's fire did indeed occur, burning naval arsenals and harbour warehouses. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Ammianus Marcellinus document the military necessity of setting fire to his own ships to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, and how those flames spread to the surrounding port area. You can visualize the fear and confusion as valuable goods, and potentially some scrolls stored in these dockside facilities were consumed. This was undoubtedly a loss, a regrettable consequence of war, but it was not, as the pervasive myth suggests, the complete and utter destruction of the main Library of Alexandria, the magnificent Mouseion itself. Crucially, the evidence suggests a more resilient institution. Consider the account of Strabo, the renowned Greek geographer, who visited Alexandria approximately 30 years after Caesar's fire. He described a functioning scholarly community, a vibrant Mouseion that, while perhaps past its absolute peak, was still a centre of learning and active research. You realise that if Caesar's fire had truly obliterated the main library and its vast collection, Strabo's description would be impossible. The direct historical evidence simply doesn't support the popular narrative of a single, definitive burning at Caesar's hand. Instead, you perceive this event as a critical tremor, a significant blow, but one that the library largely withstood. It highlights the vulnerability of such an institution during times of political instability and military conflict. Scrolls stored away from the main complex, perhaps in less secure locations near the docks, were indeed lost. But the heart of the library, its main collection within the Mouseion, appears to have persevered. This nuanced reality challenges the compelling simplicity of the myth, forcing you to look beyond the immediate drama for the more complex truth. You realize that blaming Caesar for the total destruction is a convenient historical shorthand, an attempt to pinpoint a singular villain for a tragedy far more protracted and multifaceted. The sharp sting of salt and smoke in the harbour air reminds you that while war undoubtedly causes immense damage, the narrative of the library's end requires you to look far beyond this single event, to centuries of gradual decline, shifting priorities, and other deliberate acts of destruction that ultimately sealed its fate. The journey to understand the real reason the library burned is just beginning here, at the scene of its first misunderstood challenge. You are enveloped by a cacophony of sounds, the frantic shouts of sailors, the clang of metal against stone, and then the deafening roar of a fire set by accident, not malice, consuming everything in its path. This is the year 48 BCE, and you are plunged into the heart of Alexandria's bustling harbour, witnessing the chaotic battle unfolding between Julius Caesar's forces and those of Ptolemy's force. You feel the heat, the oppressive wave of it, as flames leap from ship to dock, engulfing precious timber and cargo. This dramatic scene, etched into history, is often misremembered as the moment the great Library of Alexandria met its fiery end. Historical records show that during this desperate military campaign, Caesar found himself in a precarious position. To prevent his fleet from falling into enemy hands, ancient sources like Plutarch document his decision to set fire to his own ships. You can almost taste the desperation in that choice. The flames, however, quickly spread, fueled by the winds and the close proximity of structures, consuming naval arsenals and numerous harbour warehouses. These warehouses certainly held valuable goods, and likely many scrolls awaiting shipment or temporary storage. The sharp smell of burning papyrus, mingled with salt and wood smoke, would have been thick in the air. This was undeniably a significant loss of intellectual material. But here you must pause and discern historical evidence from the persistent, romanticized myth. Contrary to popular belief, ancient sources documenting Caesar's fire, while describing the damage to the port, do not confirm that these flames reached the main Library of Alexandria, that magnificent Mouseion complex renowned across the known world. The main library, you realize, was likely located some distance from the immediate harbour district. The evidence suggests that the institution, though perhaps shaken, largely endured. Consider Strabo, the esteemed Greek geographer who visited Alexandria approximately 30 years after Caesar's fire. He meticulously described a vibrant scholarly community, a functioning Mouseion, and an active intellectual life. You perceive the palpable presence of scholars, still working, still debating, still adding to the repository of knowledge. If Caesar's fire had truly obliterated the entire library, Strabo's detailed account would be an impossibility. His testimony is a crucial anchor, pulling you back from the sweeping drama of the myth to a more grounded historical reality. You understand now that while Caesar's fire was indeed a destructive event, leading to the loss of perhaps tens of thousands of scrolls in the harbour, it was not the singular, annihilating inferno that consumed the entirety of the Library of Alexandria. It was an accident of war, a tragic collateral damage, but not the deliberate malice or the total wipeout so often depicted. The deafening roar of that fire, set by strategic necessity rather than intellectual hatred, was but one chapter in a much longer, far more complex, and ultimately more tragic story of gradual decline. You realize that sometimes the loudest moments in history are not always the most definitive, and that true devastation often unfolds in a quiet, drawn-out fade, rather than a sudden, spectacular blaze. You rub your thumb across an imaginary ancient manuscript, feeling the greasy, dark touch of soot, not from a single, catastrophic fire, but from the lingering smoke of historical ambiguity and the persistent human desire for a simple narrative. This lingering residue represents the popular myth you've carried about the Library of Alexandria, a singular, dramatic conflagration that erased all ancient knowledge in one night. But as you've journeyed through the complex timeline of its decline, you realize that this appealing, yet ultimately false, story overshadows a far more sobering reality of gradual loss and multiple destructive events across centuries. You now understand that the burning of the library wasn't one definitive event, but a series of challenges and erosions. You've seen how Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, while causing damage to harbour warehouses and potentially some stored scrolls, did not, according to ancient sources like Strabo, confirm the destruction of the main Mouseion library. Strabo's account of a functioning scholarly community decades later stands as crucial evidence against that singular, dramatic claim. This was collateral damage from war, not the obliteration of the entire institution. Then, centuries later, you encountered the undeniable, deliberate destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE. You recall the Christian mobs, led by Patriarch Theophilus, acting out of religious zealotry, systematically dismantling this symbol of pagan learning. This was a direct, well-documented act of intellectual suppression, a stark example of how shifting cultural priorities and intolerance can directly target and annihilate knowledge. You feel the chilling difference: accidental military damage versus deliberate religious persecution. But perhaps the most tragic and pervasive cause of loss was neither fire nor direct attack, but the slow, insidious creep of imperial neglect. As the Roman Empire itself declined, so did its financial support for grand institutions like the library. The colossal collection of fragile papyrus scrolls required immense and costly maintenance, constant copying, and careful preservation in a humid climate. You envision the gradual abandonment, the quiet rot from damp and insects, as scrolls were simply discarded as pagan relics or ceased to be copied. The main library likely withered this way, a death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single fiery blow. And the dramatic narrative of Caliph Omar burning the library during the Arab conquest in 641 CE? Modern scholarship, examining Arab historians and other sources, largely considers this a fabricated tale, appearing 600 years after the supposed event. By the time of the Arab conquest, any meaningful institution known as the Library of Alexandria was already long gone, a ghost of its former self. The profound reflection that emerges from this journey is that the Library of Alexandria wasn't killed in one night by one fire. It died slowly, across centuries, as a civilization stopped caring enough to preserve its accumulated wisdom. That's the real tragedy. Not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And this sobering truth compels you to ask, what knowledge are we, today, failing to preserve? What will future generations mourn that we let slip away through neglect, lost not in a blaze, but in the quiet, greasy touch of indifference and fading memory? This lingering question, more than any single event, is the true legacy of Alexandria's end. You feel the delicate crispness of aged papyrus, carefully unrolling a scroll not consumed by flames, but preserved through centuries of diligent care. It's a tangible link to a past that almost vanished, a testament to what survived the slow death of Alexandria. This moment of connection to a preserved text makes you understand that the story of the library's decline isn't just about what was lost, it's also about a desperate, ongoing triage of knowledge, an effort to save what could be saved, even as much slipped away forever. As the great Library of Alexandria suffered its protracted decline, battered by accidental fires like Caesar's in the harbour, assaulted by deliberate acts like the Christian destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, and eroded by centuries of neglect, some precious fragments of its vast collection found unexpected havens. You realize that even in its twilight, Alexandria wasn't the only intellectual center. Other libraries across the ancient world held duplicates, or were themselves repositories of significant knowledge. You picture these scrolls, perhaps fewer in number than those lost, being painstakingly copied, smuggled, or simply relocated to safer climes. Crucially, you witness the immense effort of preservation that unfolded in later centuries, particularly within the burgeoning Islamic world. Historical records show that from the 8th century onwards, Islamic scholars embarked on a monumental translation movement. You imagine dedicated scribes and translators working in vibrant centers like Baghdad, meticulously converting Greek texts, works of philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy into Arabic. These were not mere passive acts of storage. They were active engagements with ancient wisdom, ensuring that the insights of Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen would not only endure, but also spark new advancements. Without this diligent effort, much of what you know today of classical Greek thought would be permanently lost. Simultaneously, you perceive the quiet, steadfast work of Byzantine scholars in the Eastern Roman Empire. They continued to maintain and copy many Greek works, safeguarding a significant portion of the classical literary and philosophical tradition within their own libraries and monasteries. These two powerful currents of preservation, the Islamic and the Byzantine, formed a vital intellectual bridge, keeping the flame of ancient knowledge alive through centuries when Western Europe experienced its own period of intellectual contraction. Much later, you witness the intellectual reawakening of the European Renaissance. Scholars, rediscovering ancient Greek texts, often through Arabic translations or direct contact with Byzantine libraries, experienced a profound rebirth of knowledge. You feel the excitement of this rediscovery, the sense of an ancient inheritance being reclaimed, breathing new life into dormant ideas and fundamentally shaping the course of modern science and philosophy. However, despite these monumental acts of preservation, you cannot escape the poignant reality of what was irrevocably lost. You remember those staggering estimates of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls housed in Alexandria. The evidence suggests that many of these were unique copies, works never duplicated elsewhere. When the library declined, these texts didn't just burn, they rotted from neglect, were discarded as paganism, or were simply lost as scribes stopped copying them. You feel the immense, silent void of those unique works, those profound insights, those scientific discoveries that existed nowhere else, and were therefore permanently silenced. The agony of this unquantifiable loss, the knowledge forever beyond your reach, becomes acutely clear. The triage of knowledge then was incomplete. What survived, you realize, was a precious fragment, a lucky few, allowing humanity to reconstruct pieces of its ancient past. But the vast majority, the unique, the obscure, the once held dear, is gone forever. This enduring mystery, this absence, is perhaps the most profound legacy of the Library of Alexandria's complex and drawn-out demise. It reminds you that the preservation of knowledge is an active, continuous battle, a constant effort against the forces of destruction, neglect, and the inevitable passage of time. You feel a cold, insidious draft sweeping through the once grand halls of the Mouseion, a chill that signals not a broken window, but the silent, deadly consequence of a patron's empty coffers. This sensation of financial neglect is perhaps the most overlooked, yet profoundly destructive force in the true story of the Library of Alexandria's demise. More than any dramatic fire, the slow erosion of imperial support and a dwindling budget contributed to its long, agonizing fade into obscurity. This financial drought, rather than a single flood of flames, is the true tragedy of its end. The library, in its zenith, was a monumental undertaking, an intellectual marvel powered by the immense wealth and ambition of the Ptolemaic pharaohs. You recall their initial boundless vision, to collect every book in the world, to house the greatest scholars, to create an unparalleled center of learning. This required enormous, continuous investment. Skilled librarians, meticulous scribes for copying, agents across the globe acquiring new texts, specialized conservators to preserve fragile papyrus in a humid climate, all demanded a steady, substantial flow of resources. You perceive the vibrant hum of activity, fueled by lavish royal patronage. However, as centuries passed and Alexandria fell under Roman rule, the priorities of its patrons shifted. You sense the gradual tightening of purse strings, the increasing indifference from distant Roman emperors whose attention was divided by the vast complexities of a sprawling, often unstable empire. Historical records show a decreasing imperial support for cultural institutions that no longer served an immediate political purpose or aligned with evolving Roman values. The library, once a jewel in the Ptolemaic crown, became just one more expense in a vast imperial budget, competing with military campaigns, public works, and the needs of a struggling populace. This reduction in funding was a death by 1,000 cuts. You imagine the direct consequences: fewer new acquisitions, halting the vital intake of fresh knowledge. Fewer scribes meant older scrolls were not recopied, allowing the fragile papyrus to disintegrate from age and humidity. Fewer conservators meant the existing collection deteriorated unchecked. The Mouseion, once a magnet for brilliant minds, found it harder to attract and retain top scholars without generous stipends. The intellectual community, the very lifeblood of the library, began to dissipate. This slow starvation, this relentless draft from empty coffers, meant that the magnificent collection of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls wasn't consumed in a single dramatic fire. Instead, countless works slowly rotted from neglect, were devoured by insects, or simply vanished as their physical form disintegrated without renewal. The burning here was a metaphorical one, the slow, quiet incineration of knowledge through sustained apathy and financial deprivation. You realize that this gradual decline, driven by economic and political shifts, is far more sobering than a dramatic conflagration. It forces you to confront the often unseen forces that undermine intellectual progress. The absence of a patron's support, the cold draft from empty coffers, ultimately proved more devastating than any single act of arson. It serves as a powerful reminder that knowledge, however grand, is a fragile creation, requiring continuous, dedicated investment to thrive and endure. You feel it now, a subtle, chilling draft, not from the desert wind, but from the slow creep of irrelevance in a changing empire. It's the sensation of a grand institution, once vital, becoming gradually unmoored from the priorities of its rulers and the evolving spirit of its age. This insidious shift, more than any single dramatic fire, is a crucial, often overlooked chapter in the true story of the Library of Alexandria's decline. It's the subtle, agonizing process of a vibrant intellectual heart losing its pulse as the world around it moved on. In its zenith, under the Ptolemaic pharaohs, the library and Mouseion were symbols of power, prestige, and unparalleled intellectual ambition. You recall how vast resources were poured into acquiring, copying, and maintaining its staggering collection of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. But as the centuries wore on, and Alexandria passed from Ptolemaic hands into the sprawling, often chaotic embrace of the Roman Empire, that foundational patronage began to wither. You sense the gradual disengagement from distant emperors whose attention was consumed by military campaigns, political intrigue, and the pressing needs of maintaining a vast and fractious domain. The library, once a cherished jewel, slowly became an expensive anachronism. This decreasing imperial support was catastrophic. The colossal collection, primarily composed of fragile papyrus, demanded continuous, costly maintenance. You imagine the immense labor involved: skilled scribes painstakingly copying decaying texts, conservators battling the relentless humidity and insects, agents constantly seeking new acquisitions. Without steady funding, these vital activities dwindled. Scrolls began to rot from neglect, uncopied works disintegrated, and the very physical fabric of the institution slowly decayed. This was not a fire. This was a slow, agonizing suffocation by indifference, a burning of knowledge through sustained apathy. Compounding this financial and political neglect was a profound cultural and ideological shift. As Christianity rose to prominence across the Roman Empire, a growing hostility toward pagan Greek learning emerged. You perceive the tension, the intellectual clash between classical philosophy and the new ascendant theological doctrines. Works of ancient Greek thought, once celebrated, were increasingly viewed with suspicion, deemed pagan, or even dangerous. The Christian destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE stands as a brutal, well-documented testament to this changing intellectual climate, a deliberate act of eradication against what was considered a repository of heretical knowledge. While the main Mouseion library avoided such a definitive, violent end, it undoubtedly suffered from the same pervading hostility. The empire's general decline, marked by instability, economic hardship, and internal strife, further accelerated the library's demise. You realize that in an era of existential challenges, maintaining a vast, expensive institution dedicated to abstract learning became a luxury few could afford, or even valued. The intellectual community dispersed, the flow of new ideas diminished, and the vibrant hum of a dozen languages in its halls faded into a quiet, dusty silence. By the time of the Arab conquest in 641 CE, any semblance of the great library was likely long gone, a ghost of its former glory. The true tragedy of the Library of Alexandria, then, is the slow creep of irrelevance. It died, not in one night, but over generations, as a civilization allowed its own invaluable wisdom to slip away through neglect, religious intolerance, political instability, and a fundamental shift in cultural priorities. You are left to reflect on the vulnerability of even the grandest repositories of knowledge, and how crucial it is to actively value, defend, and invest in the preservation of wisdom, lest it too succumb to the insidious forces of indifference. You enter a lecture hall within the Mouseion, and a sudden, profound stillness descends, like a shroud. This isn't the quiet of thoughtful study, but the eerie silence of a space deliberately purged, its vibrant intellectual life extinguished. You feel the ghost of debates that once echoed here, the murmur of discovery, the passionate exchange of ideas. This chilling quiet is a direct consequence of a deliberate cultural shift, the systematic suppression of pagan learning that began to sweep across the Roman Empire, impacting institutions like the Library of Alexandria, and tragically costing humanity centuries of intellectual momentum. In its prime, Alexandria was a crucible of diverse thought, a place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian wisdom, and knowledge from across the known world converged. You recall the hum of a dozen languages, the respectful, even eager, intellectual exchange. But as the Roman Empire transitioned, and Christianity became its dominant religion, a profound ideological shift began to take hold. Ancient sources document the rise of Christian hostility toward pagan learning and institutions associated with it. You perceive the growing tension, the increasing pressure to conform to a new set of intellectual and spiritual doctrines. This cultural shift manifested in devastating ways. You've already witnessed the brutal destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE, an undeniable act of religious persecution orchestrated by Patriarch Theophilus. That event was a stark warning, a physical manifestation of this new intolerance. While the main Mouseion library might not have faced such a dramatic, singular assault, it certainly fell victim to the same pervasive hostility. You imagine scholars abandoning their posts, not because of fire, but because their work was no longer valued, or worse, deemed dangerous. The collection itself, focused on classical Greek texts, became increasingly irrelevant or even offensive to the new cultural zeitgeist. The very concept of a universal library, housing all knowledge regardless of its origin, began to clash with a society increasingly focused on a singular, divine truth. You sense the shrinking space for diverse perspectives, the narrowing of the intellectual horizon. Funds, once generously allocated for pagan scholarship, were redirected to support Christian theological studies and institutions. This financial starvation, coupled with the ideological pressure, meant the library's vast collection began to crumble. Texts were discarded as relics of a condemned past, no longer copied, no longer cared for. The slow creep of irrelevance was as destructive as any flame. The sudden stillness in this imagined lecture hall is therefore a deafening testament to this cultural purge. It signifies the silencing of voices, the suppression of inquiry, and the deliberate abandonment of an intellectual tradition. You realize that the burning of Alexandria's knowledge wasn't just physical destruction. It was a profound ideological shift that created an environment where ancient wisdom could no longer thrive. It makes you reflect on the fragility of open inquiry and the constant need to defend intellectual diversity, lest the stillness of a purged hall descends upon your own time. This is the enduring lesson from Alexandria, the cost of intellectual monoculture and the immense value of every voice, every perspective, even those that challenge prevailing beliefs. You taste it now, a dry, bitter flavor on your tongue, the distinct taste of fear mingling with the stale air in what were once vibrant lecture halls and bustling scriptoria. It's the phantom sensation of the world's greatest minds choosing flight over persecution, seeking refuge from a shifting tide of intolerance. You perceive their hurried footsteps, the furtive glances over their shoulders as they packed what precious scrolls they could, abandoning the intellectual heart of Alexandria not to a single dramatic fire, but to a climate of growing repression. This exodus, this brain drain, marks a profound yet often unremarked phase in the library's complex demise. Following the brutal, well-documented Christian destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus, a clear message echoed through Alexandria. Pagan learning was no longer welcome, and indeed was actively dangerous. You feel the chilling impact of this deliberate act, not just on physical structures, but on the very spirit of open inquiry that had defined the Mouseion for centuries. The intellectual landscape irrevocably changed. Scholars, philosophers, and scientists who once thrived on diverse perspectives now faced a stark choice: convert, conform, or flee. Ancient sources document this period of intense religious hostility. You imagine the conversations, hushed and urgent, among those who valued classical Greek thought. Their pursuit of knowledge, once celebrated by the Ptolemies and tolerated by earlier Roman emperors, was now deemed heretical or irrelevant by the ascendant Christian authority. The very concept of universal knowledge, gathered from all cultures, clashed with a new focus on singular, divine truth. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic blaze, but a slow, suffocating pressure that forced intellectual light to scatter. The evidence suggests that many scholars, fearing for their safety, their careers, or the very integrity of their work, began to disperse. You picture them leaving Alexandria for more welcoming intellectual centers, carrying what precious knowledge they could, but leaving behind the vast bulk of the library's immense collection. This exodus meant that priceless insights, unique copies, and ongoing research simply ceased within Alexandria's walls. The burning here was the dispersal of intellectual energy, the gradual abandonment of the institution by those who could have sustained it. Simultaneously, the main library, already weakened by decreasing imperial support and chronic underfunding, languished further. Without a vibrant scholarly community to utilize, update, and painstakingly recopy its fragile papyrus scrolls, the process of decay accelerated. Texts weren't burned, they rotted from neglect, were discarded as pagan artifacts, or simply disappeared as scribes stopped copying them. The taste of fear in the academic air, the flight of the world's greatest minds, directly contributed to the library's slow death, leaving behind a profound intellectual void. This period of active suppression and forced dispersal highlights the fragility of knowledge when confronted by ideological intolerance. You realize that the loss here wasn't just physical destruction, but the silencing of discourse, the interruption of intellectual lineages, and the erosion of a pluralistic pursuit of truth. The Library of Alexandria, in its ultimate decline, stands as a stark reminder that knowledge is not merely stored, it must be actively cultivated, defended, and cherished by the minds it inspires. You reach for it, an imagined papyrus scroll on a dusty, forgotten shelf, and you feel the brittle crackle of its ancient fibers, stiff and unyielding, as if it hasn't been opened in a century. This isn't the sensation of ash or the heat of a recent fire, but the cold, dry touch of prolonged disuse and slow decay. It's the physical manifestation of neglect, a potent symbol of how much of the Library of Alexandria's vast wisdom simply withered away rather than being dramatically consumed by a singular blaze. This silent, insidious process of loss, you realize, is far more tragic and pervasive than the romanticized myth of a single catastrophic burning. The popular narrative you've grown up with paints a vivid picture, a monumental library engulfed in flames, all its knowledge vanishing in one terrible night. It's a powerful, dramatic story, easy to grasp and mourn. But as you've journeyed through history, consulting ancient sources like Strabo, Plutarch, and Ammianus Marcellinus, you now understand that reality was far more complex, a tapestry woven with threads of multiple destructive events and, crucially, centuries of gradual decline. The burning wasn't one event, but a civilization slowly losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. You've explored the tremor of Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, which historical records show likely burned harbour warehouses, not the main Mouseion library itself. Strabo, visiting decades later, described a functioning scholarly community, pushing back against the idea of total obliteration then. You've also confronted the undeniable Christian destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus, a deliberate act of religious persecution against pagan learning. These were significant blows, certainly, but they still don't account for the entirety of the library's immense collection. The overwhelming evidence suggests that the largest portion of the library's contents, its estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, didn't burn in dramatic flames. Instead, they suffered the fate of that brittle scroll you now imagine. They rotted from the constant humidity of the Nile Delta, were consumed by insects, or simply disintegrated from age, uncopied and unread. This was exacerbated by decreasing imperial support under later Roman emperors, who viewed the library as an expensive relic rather than a vital institution. Funds dried up, scholars dispersed, and the meticulous work of preservation, copying, cataloguing, repairing, ground to a halt. You perceive the profound impact of this imperial neglect, this cultural shift away from pagan Greek learning toward Christian theology. Texts were not just lost physically, they were discarded ideologically, seen as irrelevant or even dangerous. The slow creep of irrelevance was a fire of its own kind, a subtle, devastating conflagration that extinguished intellectual light through apathy rather than arson. This makes the tragedy all the more poignant. It wasn't a single external force that destroyed the library. It was a complex interplay of forces, culminating in a civilization's failure to maintain what it had so brilliantly created. The brittle crackle of that unopened scroll whispers a chilling truth. Sometimes the most devastating loss comes not from a sudden, violent act, but from the quiet, persistent erosion of care and intellectual investment. It prompts you to reflect on what knowledge in your own time might be silently crumbling from neglect, waiting for a champion to unroll its brittle pages before it is lost forever. You feel the oppressive stickiness of Alexandria's air, the pervasive humidity clinging to your skin, even within the imagined walls of the library. This isn't the direct threat of fire or the clamour of mobs, but a far more relentless, silent adversary, the environment itself. You realise that a great, unseen war was constantly waged within the library's walls, a desperate struggle against humidity, insidious insects, and the relentless march of time. This ceaseless battle for preservation, ultimately lost to human apathy, is perhaps the most tragic and unheralded reason for the library's true demise. The vast collection, estimated at 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, was primarily made of papyrus, a delicate material derived from the Nile reed. You can almost feel its fragile texture, understanding its inherent vulnerability. Papyrus, while revolutionary for writing, was acutely susceptible to dampness, which caused mold and disintegration. It was also a delicious feast for bookworms and other insects, which, unchecked, could devour entire works in a surprisingly short span. Maintaining such a colossal repository in Alexandria's warm, humid climate required an extraordinary, continuous effort, a constant, costly campaign against nature itself. In its prime, under the Ptolemaic pharaohs, this war was actively fought. You imagine the dedicated conservators, the legions of scribes, painstakingly copying decaying scrolls onto fresh papyrus, the meticulous efforts to control humidity and pests. This was an ongoing, expensive commitment, powered by immense royal patronage. But as the centuries wore on, and Alexandria transitioned into a Roman province, priorities shifted dramatically. You sense the cold, slow withdrawal of imperial support under later Roman emperors. The vast wealth that once fueled the library's preservation efforts dwindled. The skilled scribes, the vigilant conservators, the agents acquiring new texts, their numbers waned, their funds vanished. Without this vital, continuous investment, the relentless forces of nature took their toll. The evidence suggests that most of the library's immense collection didn't burn in dramatic flames. It simply rotted from the pervasive damp, was chewed to dust by insects, or crumbled into fragments from sheer age, uncopied and unread. This imperial neglect, coupled with a broader cultural shift away from pagan Greek learning toward Christian theology, created a fatal atmosphere of apathy. Texts were not just physically decaying, they were becoming ideologically irrelevant, even dangerous. Why invest precious resources in preserving works deemed pagan or superseded by new religious doctrine? You perceive the subtle yet devastating impact of indifference, allowing invaluable wisdom to silently slip away. The burning here was a metaphorical one, the slow, quiet incineration of knowledge through sustained neglect and a profound lack of care. The romantic myth of a single, catastrophic fire, while dramatic, ultimately deflects from this more uncomfortable truth. It's easier to mourn a sudden tragedy with a clear villain than to confront the insidious, prolonged erosion of neglect. The Library of Alexandria's real demise was a protracted war against humidity, insects, and ultimately, human apathy. You realize that the preservation of knowledge is not a one-time achievement, but a continuous, active struggle, a constant battle against both natural decay and the more insidious forces of human indifference. And that fight, you understand, is one that every generation must wage anew. You feel the earth tremble, a deep, resonant shockwave vibrating through your bones as a Roman battering ram smashes against the city gates of Alexandria. This isn't the direct assault on a library, but the chilling reverberation of political instability and imperial conflict that frequently engulfed the city, indirectly contributing to the library's slow, agonizing demise. You sense the anxiety, the fear of siege and conquest, understanding how these tumultuous periods diverted resources, scattered scholars, and ultimately created an environment where the preservation of knowledge became a low, often impossible priority. The popular myth of a single catastrophic fire destroying all ancient knowledge in one night, often attributed to Julius Caesar's actions in 48 BCE, provides a dramatic, convenient villain. But as you've journeyed through history, consulting ancient sources, you know this image is incomplete. Caesar's fire, while impacting harbour warehouses, did not confirm the destruction of the main Mouseion library itself. Instead, you've seen a more nuanced reality, a gradual decline punctuated by multiple destructive events, one of the most persistent being the sheer political instability that plagued Alexandria for centuries. From the internecine struggles of the later Ptolemaic dynasty, through the various Roman civil wars, and into the tumultuous periods of imperial decline, Alexandria was often a battleground or a contested prize. You imagine the frequent sieges, the internal strife, the shifting allegiances, and the constant threat of violence. These periods of intense political instability had devastating, though often indirect, consequences for an institution like the library. Firstly, you perceive the diversion of critical resources. Empires at war or grappling with internal unrest naturally prioritized military spending and maintaining order over funding academic pursuits. The lavish patronage that once sustained the library under the early Ptolemies gradually evaporated. Without a steady stream of funds, the essential work of copying decaying scrolls, acquiring new texts, and employing skilled scholars simply could not continue. The burning here was a slow financial starvation, an intellectual drought caused by political turmoil. Secondly, you witness the exodus of minds. When a city is perpetually unstable, its greatest scholars, its intellectual lifeblood, will often seek safer, more conducive environments for their work. You imagine professors, astronomers, and philosophers packing what precious scrolls they could, fleeing Alexandria for centres like Athens, Pergamum, or later Constantinople. This brain drain stripped the library of the very intellectual energy that sustained it, leading to a decline in research, debate, and the active engagement with its collection. A library is not merely its books, it is its living, breathing community of scholars. Finally, you understand how political instability fostered an atmosphere of neglect and indifference. In times of crisis, the long-term preservation of ancient texts becomes a luxury. When cities are under siege, survival is the priority, not scholarship. The immense collection, vulnerable to humidity and insects, was left unchecked, left to slowly rot and disintegrate. The shockwave of that Roman battering ram, then, is a powerful reminder that the library's end was not just about a few dramatic fires. It was a prolonged agony, deeply intertwined with the political fate of its city and the broader Roman Empire. You realize that stability, peace, and dedicated patronage are as crucial for the flourishing of knowledge as intellectual brilliance itself. When these pillars crumble, even the grandest repositories of wisdom can fall, slowly, silently, swallowed by the sands of time. You feel the very ground beneath you shake, a dull thud, followed by the clang of steel and a distant cry, as the royal quarter of Alexandria transforms into a battleground. This isn't the distant rumble of Caesar's harbour fire, but the immediate, visceral experience of conflict encroaching upon what should be the city's most secure and serene intellectual heart. You sense the panic, the desperate movement of people, as the very arteries of the city, designed for royal ceremony and scholarly pursuit, become choked with soldiers and the debris of conflict. The constant political instability that plagued Alexandria for centuries, turning its streets into contested territory, was an invisible fire that consumed the library slowly, by making its very existence untenable. Contrary to the popular myth of a single, clean strike against knowledge, the historical reality reveals that Alexandria was frequently a city besieged, its leadership often violently overthrown. You recall periods of intense Roman civil wars, local uprisings, and imperial interventions that repeatedly turned the city into a theatre of war. Imagine trying to conduct meticulous research, to painstakingly copy fragile scrolls, when outside your window the clash of swords and the shouts of warring factions are a constant, terrifying soundtrack. You perceive the palpable fear, the profound anxiety that would permeate such an environment, making dedicated scholarship a dangerous luxury. Historical records show how such instability directly impacted institutions like the Mouseion. Scholars, the very lifeblood of the library, often fled the city, seeking safer havens for their work. You visualize them, perhaps clutching a few invaluable personal scrolls, making desperate escapes from a city under siege, abandoning vast portions of the collection to an uncertain fate. This exodus of minds was a catastrophic brain drain, stripping the library of the very intellectual energy that sustained its growth and vibrancy. A library, you realize, is not just its books, it is the living community that breathes life into them. Moreover, the constant state of conflict meant a severe diversion of resources. Empires, when fighting for survival or supremacy, prioritized military spending over academic endowments. You sense the tightening of purse strings, the slow withdrawal of funds that were once lavished upon the library. Without this crucial financial support, the relentless war against humidity and insects, the continuous work of copying and preserving fragile papyrus, simply ground to a halt. The vast collection of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, already vulnerable, was left to disintegrate, unread and uncared for amidst the chaos. The evidence suggests that these periods of internal strife and external conquest, turning the royal quarter into a battlefield, chipped away at the library's foundations year after year, century after century. It was an indirect yet devastating form of burning, where neglect and the impossibility of intellectual work slowly consumed the institution. The echoes of battle, the cries of fear, and the pervasive sense of danger became a more enduring threat than any single dramatic conflagration. You understand that peace and stability are not just societal luxuries, but absolute necessities for the enduring preservation and advancement of human knowledge. You walk into a vast, near-empty chamber, your footsteps echoing hollowly, each sound reverberating with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten conversations and untold discoveries. The silence is profound, not the buzz of intellectual activity, but the deep quiet of absence. This is the Mouseion, once the vibrant heart of the Library of Alexandria, now a stark testament to its long, slow decline. You feel the cool, dry air, no hint of smoke or recent fire, only the undeniable chill of abandonment. This eerie emptiness, rather than a dramatic blaze, represents the true, more tragic end of one of humanity's greatest intellectual treasures. You have journeyed through the complexities of its history, dismantling the popular myth of a single catastrophic burning. You've seen that Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, while damaging harbour warehouses, did not, according to ancient sources like Strabo, confirm the destruction of the main library. You've confronted the well-documented Christian destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus, a deliberate act of religious persecution. These were significant blows, yet still not the definitive, all-encompassing end. The evidence consistently points to a far more insidious culprit: gradual decline through neglect. As the Roman Empire itself descended into instability and financial strain, imperial support for the library, once its lifeblood, waned dramatically. You recall the constant, costly battle against humidity and insects, the need for continuous copying and conservation of fragile papyrus scrolls. Without dedicated funding, this essential work ceased. The magnificent collection of 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls didn't burn. They simply rotted, disintegrated, or were discarded. The burning was a slow, metaphoric one, a loss through sustained apathy. Compounding this was a profound cultural shift. You've perceived the increasing Christian hostility toward pagan learning, which made classical Greek texts, the core of the library's collection, unwelcome or irrelevant. Scholars, facing an environment of dwindling resources and ideological pressure, dispersed. The vibrant intellectual community that fueled the library's purpose slowly evaporated. By the time of the largely mythological Arab conquest in 641 CE, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense, was already gone, its chambers echoing just as hollowly as the one you now stand in. The pervasive romantic myth of a single, dramatic fire, while appealing, ultimately shields you from the more uncomfortable reality. It's simpler to blame one villain than to confront the truth. That civilizations often lose their libraries through apathy, political instability, and changing cultural priorities, not just through arson. This gradual abandonment is far more sobering, for it reveals a collective failure to value and preserve one's own accumulated wisdom. The cultural impact of this slow death is immeasurable. It's not just texts. It's the accumulated knowledge, the unique insights, the intellectual lineages that vanished, setting humanity back centuries. While some work survived through copies in other libraries, much was permanently lost. This hollow chamber, then, is not just an archaeological site. It's a poignant reminder that the Library of Alexandria wasn't killed in one night by one fire. It died slowly as a civilization stopped caring about preserving knowledge. That, you realize, is the real tragedy. Not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And it compels you to consider, what knowledge are we failing to preserve today? What will future generations mourn that we let slip away through neglect, leaving behind only the hollow sound of footsteps in an empty hall? You walk through the hollow chambers and you feel them now, the ghosts of giants. Euclid, Archimedes, Hypatia, you sense their lingering presence, a faint intellectual echo in the cool, silent air. You perceive the immense, almost physical burden of their fading legacy, the weight of a monumental inheritance that was allowed to slip away, not in a single cataclysmic blaze, but through a gradual, agonizing process of neglect, intolerance, and shifting priorities across centuries. This feeling, this deep sense of unfulfilled potential and irretrievable loss, is the true emotional core of the Library of Alexandria's complex demise. For so long, you, like countless others, have been drawn to the romanticized myth of a single catastrophic fire, a dramatic inferno that consumed all ancient knowledge in one terrible night. It's a powerful narrative, offering a clear villain and a definitive, easily mourned ending. But as you've journeyed through the fragmented historical records and balanced perspectives from ancient sources, Strabo, Plutarch, Ammianus Marcellinus, and later Arab historians, you now understand this appealing story is false. The sobering historical reality is far messier and ultimately more tragic. You recall Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, an accidental conflagration that affected harbour warehouses, not the main Mouseion library itself. Strabo's account, decades later, of a functioning scholarly community, stands as crucial evidence against the total destruction myth then. You also remembers the stark, well-documented Christian destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus, a deliberate act of religious persecution that annihilated a significant collection. These were profound blows, certainly, yet they were not the singular, all-encompassing end of the entire Alexandrian intellectual heritage. The evidence consistently suggests that the primary culprit in the library's decline was a long, slow death by 1,000 cuts, decreasing imperial support under later Roman emperors, leading to a crippling lack of funds for maintenance and copying. Widespread Christian hostility toward pagan learning, causing scholars to disperse and texts to be discarded, and the general decline and political instability of the empire, which simply shifted priorities away from lavish academic patronage. The library's estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, many unique copies of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature, didn't burn in flames. They rotted from humidity, were eaten by insects, or simply lost as scribes stopped copying them, succumbing to the relentless war against natural decay, a war ultimately lost to human apathy. Even the dramatic story of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE, you now know, first appears 600 years later and is widely considered fabricated. By then, the library, in any meaningful sense, was already gone. This reality is more difficult to grasp, more uncomfortable to confront. It lacks a clear villain, presenting instead a collective failure. The cultural impact is immense. Not just texts, but entire fields of accumulated knowledge vanished, setting human progress back centuries. While some works survived through copies in other libraries, diligently preserved by Islamic and Byzantine scholars, and later rediscovered in the Renaissance, much was permanently lost, leaving you with the haunting presence of these intellectual ghosts and the unanswered questions they embody. The Library of Alexandria wasn't killed in one night by one fire. It died slowly as a civilization, across many centuries, stopped caring enough to preserve its accumulated wisdom. That, you realize, is the real tragedy. Not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And this profound reflection leaves you with an inescapable question for your own time. What knowledge are we failing to preserve today? What will future generations mourn that we let slip away through neglect, lost not in a blaze, but in the quiet, fading burden of a forgotten legacy? You trace the smooth, supple feel of a parchment codex, its pages bound firmly, a stark contrast to the brittle, fragile papyrus scrolls that dominated the ancient Library of Alexandria. This shift in technology, from unwieldy scrolls to robust, page-bound books, represents a quiet revolution in knowledge preservation, a technological lifeline for some of the wisdom that escaped Alexandria's fate. This enduring material, crafted from animal skin, offered a resilience that fragile papyrus simply could not match, allowing a portion of ancient learning to survive the library's complex, protracted demise. You've journeyed through the intricate timeline of the library's destruction, dispelling the pervasive myth of a single catastrophic fire. You now understand that Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE while damaging harbour warehouses, did not confirm the destruction of the main Mouseion library, which Strabo documented as functioning decades later. You witnessed the definitive, religiously motivated destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE by Christian mobs under Patriarch Theophilus. But the greatest loss, you realize, came from decreasing imperial support, Christian hostility toward pagan learning, the empire's general decline, and the relentless, silent war against humidity, insects, and human apathy that slowly consumed hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. It's precisely in this context of widespread loss that the adoption of parchment codices becomes so significant. While the main Library of Alexandria primarily housed papyrus scrolls, other centers of learning, and even later iterations of Alexandrian scholarship began to embrace this new format. You imagine scribes carefully transcribing texts from delicate papyrus onto durable parchment, sensing the foresight, the desperate hope to save what they could. Parchment could withstand handling, moisture, and time far better than papyrus, offering a much greater chance of long-term survival. This technological evolution played a critical role in the survival of many classical Greek texts. You perceive the Byzantine Empire maintaining its own robust scholarly traditions, meticulously copying ancient works onto parchment codices. Similarly, as the Islamic Golden Age flourished, scholars in Baghdad and elsewhere actively sought out, translated and copied Greek texts, often preserving them in parchment codex form. These centers, through their embrace of more durable materials and dedicated preservation efforts, became unintentional ark builders for Alexandria's scattered legacy. The tactile experience of a parchment codex, then, is a direct connection to this act of intellectual salvation. You can open its pages, flip through them, study them with an ease impossible with delicate scrolls. This format allowed knowledge to travel more easily, to be studied more thoroughly, and to endure centuries of political and cultural upheaval. While we will never know what unique copies, what profound insights, what scientific breakthroughs were permanently lost from Alexandria's estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, you realize that the supple feel of this parchment codex represents the resilience of human knowledge. It is a testament to the fact that even in the face of immense destruction and neglect, humanity, through foresight and diligent effort, managed to salvage a precious portion of its intellectual heritage, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients could continue to inform and inspire future generations. This quiet revolution in material, you conclude, played an unsung but vital role in defying total obliteration. You feel its age, the papyrus scroll in your mind's grasp, almost disintegrating between your fingers, not from fire, but from the relentless grip of time and decay. This is the crippling cost of an obsolete technology, a profound underlying factor in the slow demise of the Library of Alexandria. You realize that papyrus, while revolutionary for its era, was inherently fragile, demanding an enormous continuous investment to simply exist, let alone thrive. This inescapable material reality, more than any single dramatic blaze, sealed the library's fate. In its glorious inception, the library's massive collection, estimated at 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, was primarily made of papyrus. You visualize the delicate sheets, created from the pressed pith of the Nile reed, meticulously joined to form long rolls. This material, though groundbreaking, was acutely vulnerable. It hated humidity, prone to mold and insect infestation, and it aged poorly, becoming brittle and disintegrating over centuries. To maintain such a colossal repository required a dedicated, endless war against natural decay. You perceive the immense, crippling cost this entailed. It wasn't enough to simply collect scrolls. They had to be constantly cared for, repaired, and most importantly, recopied. You imagine legions of skilled scribes toiling year after year, painstakingly transcribing decaying texts onto fresh papyrus rolls. There were conservators battling moisture and pests, agents acquiring new papyrus, and a vast administrative apparatus to manage it all. This was an extraordinarily expensive, labour-intensive endeavour, sustained for centuries only by the lavish, unwavering patronage of the Ptolemaic pharaohs. But as the political landscape shifted and Alexandria transitioned under Roman rule, that lifeline of imperial support began to fray. You recall the decreasing patronage under later Roman emperors, their priorities fragmented by a vast, unstable empire. The generous flow of funds, once dedicated to the library's very survival, dwindled to a trickle. Without the continuous, immense investment, the relentless forces of humidity and insects took their toll, unchecked. The evidence suggests that most of the collection didn't burn in flames. It simply rotted, disintegrated, or was consumed by pests. The burning was a slow, agonizing process of material decay, a casualty of a cripplingly expensive, soon-to-be obsolete technology. Simultaneously, a new technology was emerging: parchment codices. Made from animal skins, parchment was far more durable, less susceptible to moisture and insects, and the codex format, bound pages like modern books, was easier to handle and store. You perceive the irony. As papyrus became an unsustainable burden, a superior technology was available, but by then, the library's financial and cultural support had already collapsed. The crippling cost of maintaining an obsolete technology, coupled with imperial neglect and a cultural shift away from pagan learning, condemned the vast majority of its contents to oblivion. This makes you understand the deep, structural vulnerability of knowledge itself. It's not just about what is written, but on what material and with what enduring commitment from its guardians. The Library of Alexandria's decline wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was a profound illustration of how intellectual treasures can be lost when the means to sustain them, both financial and technological, are allowed to wither, a poignant reminder that even the most advanced technology can become an Achilles heel if left unmaintained. You stand on the ancient streets of Alexandria, your ears assaulted by the fanatical chant of a surging crowd, a chilling roar that drowns out the imagined, desperate plea of a philosopher. This isn't the distant clash of armies, but the terrifying sound of ideological fervour turning destructive, a stark reminder of the Christian destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE. You feel the raw emotion, the undeniable force of a belief system actively seeking to erase a competing intellectual and spiritual heritage. This deliberate act, driven by religious intolerance, stands as a pivotal, undeniable blow to Alexandrian learning. The popular myth of a single, catastrophic fire destroying all ancient knowledge often seeks a dramatic, singular culprit, be it Julius Caesar in 48 BCE or Caliph Omar in 641 CE. But as you've journeyed through documented historical evidence, you've dismantled that oversimplified narrative. Caesar's fire, while damaging harbour warehouses, did not confirm the destruction of the main Mouseion library. And the story of Caliph Omar, you now know, is largely fabricated, appearing centuries later. The events of 391 CE, however, are unequivocally documented by ancient sources. You witness the Christian patriarch Theophilus orchestrating the destruction of the Serapeum, a magnificent temple that also housed a significant library collection. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, systematic campaign against paganism and its intellectual symbols. You perceive the palpable hostility towards classical Greek learning, which was increasingly viewed as anathema to the ascendant Christian worldview. The philosopher's unheard plea represents the silencing of voices that championed alternative ways of understanding the world. You imagine the mob, fueled by religious zeal, not just targeting the Serapeum's physical structure, but actively destroying its precious contents. This wasn't merely a political takeover, it was an ideological purge. The scrolls, once revered vessels of knowledge, were now considered relics of a condemned past, fit only for obliteration. The burning here was a deliberate act of intellectual censorship, a forceful redefinition of what knowledge was deemed valuable or even permissible in a rapidly changing empire. This cultural shift had immense repercussions, impacting not only the Serapeum, but also contributing to the overall decline of the main library. When such fervent hostility becomes widespread, scholars disperse, funding for pagan institutions dries up, and the very environment for diverse intellectual inquiry withers. The absence of a physical blaze does not negate the burning of knowledge through ideological suppression. The fanatical chant you imagine on those ancient streets signifies the collective decision to prioritize dogma over dialectic, belief over boundless inquiry. You realize that this deliberate destruction, unlike the gradual decay from neglect or the accidental losses of war, represents a particularly chilling form of intellectual tragedy. It forces you to confront the very real danger of intolerance, the capacity of humanity to actively destroy knowledge that challenges its prevailing beliefs. The philosopher's unheard plea serves as a timeless warning. When the loudest voices are those of fanaticism, the whispers of wisdom are often the first to be silenced, setting human knowledge back by centuries. You hear it, the thunderous, violent crash, a sound that rips through the very fabric of the city, echoing the shattering of an ideology. You feel the tremor as a colossal marble god, the mighty Serapis himself, topples from his pedestal, striking the mosaic floor of his temple, splintering into countless fragments. This isn't the distant smoke of a harbour fire, but the immediate, visceral impact of deliberate destruction, a profound act of religious zealotry that tore through the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE, irrevocably altering the landscape of knowledge in Alexandria. You recall the pervasive myth of a single catastrophic fire, often attributed to Julius Caesar in 48 BCE. But that narrative, while dramatic, conveniently overlooks the very real, documented acts of targeted destruction. Historical records document with chilling clarity the events of 391 CE. You witness Christian patriarch Theophilus, backed by an impassioned populace, orchestrating a systematic campaign against paganism. The Serapeum, a magnificent temple that also housed a significant daughter library collection, became a primary target. You sense the fervent energy of the Christian mobs, their shouts of triumph as they dismantled statues, desecrated shrines, and most tragically, destroyed the precious scrolls within. This was not an accident of war, nor the slow decay of neglect. This was a deliberate ideological purge. You perceive the palpable hostility towards classical Greek learning, which was increasingly viewed as antithetical to the ascendant Christian worldview. The scrolls within the Serapeum were not merely physical objects, they were symbols of a fading era, repositories of a belief system now condemned. The violent crash of that marble god on the mosaic floor symbolizes the forceful rejection of an entire intellectual and spiritual heritage. The burning here wasn't by indiscriminate flames, but by the fire of religious intolerance, consciously and purposefully applied. The cultural impact of this event was immense. While the main Mouseion library had likely already suffered from dwindling support and a changing intellectual climate, the destruction of the Serapeum was a public, definitive statement. It accelerated the exodus of pagan scholars, further narrowed the intellectual horizon of Alexandria, and permanently erased countless unique works. The evidence suggests that here, knowledge was not merely lost, it was actively, violently suppressed. You realize that this dramatic, deliberate act of destruction provides a stark counterpoint to the more ambiguous accounts of the main library's demise. It highlights the vulnerability of knowledge not just to physical threats, but to ideological shifts and the fierce intolerance that can accompany them. The crashing marble, the shattered mosaics, the annihilated scrolls, these were not passive losses, but the direct result of a civilization choosing to destroy part of its own heritage in the name of a huge new truth. It forces you to reflect on the profound and often brutal cost when belief systems clash, and how quickly the intellectual treasures of one age can become the targeted relics of the next. You inhale deeply, and the air around you is thick with a cloying sweetness, the sharp, almost intoxicating scent of burning incense. But beneath it, a far more chilling aroma pierces your senses, the unmistakable, acrid smell of ancient papyrus and leather smouldering, the slow incineration of what has been deemed prohibited texts. You are not imagining a single accidental inferno, nor the vast, grand Mouseion library consumed by a widespread conflagration. Instead, you are witnessing a deliberate, chilling act of ideological cleansing, perhaps within the very courtyards of the Serapeum, around 391 CE. This scene is a stark departure from the popular myth of a single, catastrophic fire attributed to a military mishap. Here, the burning of knowledge is an act of fervent, calculated will. Historical records document, with chilling clarity, the Christian destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE under the directive of Patriarch Theophilus. You feel the raw, almost palpable conviction of those engaged in this act, their belief so absolute that it justifies the annihilation of centuries of accumulated wisdom. You perceive the profound cultural shift taking place. The ancient Greek learning, the philosophical treatises, the scientific inquiries that once formed the bedrock of Alexandrian scholarship are now viewed through a new lens of Christian hostility. The scrolls, once treasured, are transformed into symbols of paganism, considered dangerous or irrelevant to the new theological order. You see hands, not frantic in panic, but resolute in purpose, tossing bundles of papyrus onto smouldering piles. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating faces fixed with an almost zealous determination. The smell of burning incense, meant for purification and prayer, mixes grotesquely with the stench of knowledge turning to ash. This wasn't an accident. This was an intentional campaign to reshape the intellectual and spiritual landscape of Alexandria. You understand that the loss here wasn't merely collateral damage, it was a targeted obliteration, a systematic removal of texts that contradicted or challenged the prevailing religious doctrine. It stands in stark contrast to the vague accounts of earlier losses and exposes the vulnerability of knowledge to ideological fervour. While the main Library of Alexandria had already suffered a gradual decline from decreasing imperial support and sustained neglect, the destruction of the Serapeum represents a definitive, brutal blow driven by religious intolerance. It reveals that the burning of knowledge can take many forms, and not all are born of accidental flames. Sometimes it is the deliberate act of censoring, purging, and eradicating that creates the most profound and irreversible voids. The acrid smell on your tongue is a bitter reminder. When certain truths become prohibited, the fires of intolerance can consume more than just physical scrolls. They can incinerate entire pathways of human thought. You taste it now, a dry metallic bitterness clinging to your tongue, the acrid flavour of judgment. It's the phantom aftertaste of a past deemed heretical, a chilling sensation that permeates the air around you as you witness the profound moral shift that reshaped Alexandria. Here, in the late 4th century CE, the world you inhabit is no longer defined by the pluralistic pursuit of knowledge, but by the ascendant morality of a new god, a force that actively sought to purge and redefine truth. This ideological convulsion, far from a single accidental inferno, marks one of the most definitive blows to Alexandrian learning. The popular myth you've carried of a singular dramatic fire erasing all ancient knowledge often conveniently assigns blame to a military blunder or a distant caliph. But as you've journeyed through the documented historical evidence, you understand the complexity. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE likely burned harbour warehouses, not the main Mouseion library. And the tale of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE is largely considered fabricated, appearing centuries after the fact. The real story is far more nuanced, more protracted, and in the deliberate acts of 391 CE, profoundly sobering. You stand on the ancient streets of Alexandria, witnessing the unmistakable, well-documented Christian destruction of the Serapeum daughter library. This was no accident. This was a deliberate act orchestrated by Christian patriarch Theophilus, a calculated campaign against the symbols and intellectual foundations of paganism. You feel the raw force of a belief system so absolute that it sanctioned the annihilation of centuries of accumulated wisdom. The classical Greek works, the philosophical treatises, the scientific inquiries once revered, were now viewed through the lens of a new, unwavering faith, often deemed heretical, dangerous, or simply irrelevant. You perceive the profound cultural shift. Scholars who once debated freely now faced a stark choice: conform or flee. The texts, once treasures, became objects of suspicion, destined for destruction not by indiscriminate flames, but by the discerning judgmental eyes of a new authority. The burning here was orchestrated by fervent zeal, systematically targeting what was considered incompatible with the prevailing Christian doctrine. It was a triage of knowledge, but one based on moral judgment rather than intellectual merit. This period of active suppression and ideological cleansing profoundly impacted the entire intellectual landscape of Alexandria. While the main library might have already suffered from decreasing imperial support and general decline, the public, forceful destruction of the Serapeum sent an undeniable message. It contributed to the scattering of scholars and further eroded any lingering support for classical learning within the city. You realize that the cost was not just physical scrolls, but the diversity of thought, the alternative perspectives, and the very spirit of open inquiry that had once made Alexandria unique. This act of judging the past with the morality of a new god reveals a chilling truth. Knowledge is not only vulnerable to accidental fires and gradual neglect, but also to deliberate human intent. When a society decides that certain truths are prohibited, or that specific wisdom is morally impure, the fires of intolerance can consume pathways of human thought as effectively, and perhaps even more tragically, than any physical conflagration. It makes you reflect on the constant vigilance required to safeguard intellectual freedom, ensuring that the relentless march of time does not allow your own generation to taste the bitter ash of judgment, silencing voices that simply offered a different way to understand the world. You walk through the clamour of ancient Alexandria, and you sense it, the billowing steam of 1,000 bathhouses, the pervasive scent of hygiene and communal life, but with it, a faint, unsettling odour of wood smoke from countless hearths. This seemingly mundane observation connects you to one of the most persistent, yet likely mythological, narratives of the library's demise, the story of Caliph Omar's order to burn the library's scrolls as fuel for Alexandria's public baths in 641 CE. You feel the intrigue of this dramatic tale, the horror of such a deliberate, systematic obliteration, yet you also grasp the profound historical challenge of discerning truth from legend. The popular myth is potent. It paints a vivid, horrifying picture. The victorious Arab general Amr ibn al-As reporting to Caliph Omar, asking for instructions regarding the vast library. Omar's alleged reply, chillingly logical, suggested that if the books contradicted the Quran, they were heretical and must be burned. If they agreed, they were superfluous and also to be burned. This story claims that the scrolls were then distributed to the city's bathhouses, where they fueled the fires for 6 months. You imagine the roaring flames under massive cauldrons, the sheer volume of precious papyrus turned to ash, a deliberate, calculated act of intellectual vandalism. However, historical records show that this dramatic narrative first appears approximately 600 years after the supposed event. Arab historians like Ibn al-Kifti and Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi wrote about it in the 12th and 13th centuries. Crucially, earlier and more reliable accounts of the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE, written by contemporary or near-contemporary historians, including those from the Arab side, make no mention whatsoever of such an order or the destruction of the library. This conspicuous silence in primary sources is a powerful indicator that the story is, in all likelihood, a fabrication. The evidence suggests a more complex reality. By 641 CE, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense, as the vast, comprehensive repository of ancient knowledge, was already long gone. You recall its multi-century decline, battered by Caesar's fire in the harbour in 48 BCE, which didn't confirm the main library's destruction, starved by decreasing imperial support, assaulted by Christian mobs who destroyed the Serapeum in 391 CE, and ultimately withered by neglect, apathy, and the relentless forces of humidity and insects. The burning of knowledge had been a slow, protracted process, not a singular, decisive event at the hands of the Arab conquerors. You realize that the myth of Caliph Omar likely served a purpose in later periods, perhaps to demonize certain historical figures or to illustrate a particular narrative about cultural conquest. But its enduring power lies in its dramatic simplicity, its clear villain, and the shocking image of unparalleled destruction. The billowing steam of the bathhouses becomes a symbol of this historical distortion, where a compelling story, however false, can overshadow the nuanced, sobering truth. You learn that sometimes the most enduring historical facts are not facts at all, but powerful echoes of a convenient, yet ultimately untrue, narrative. You hear it now, that whispered narrative, repeated through centuries, gaining strength with each retelling. The seductive power of a story too good to be true. It's the tale of Caliph Omar, commanding the Library of Alexandria's scrolls to be burned as fuel for the city's bathhouses during the Arab conquest in 641 CE. You feel the gut-wrenching horror of such an act, the stark simplicity of its villainy. This dramatic myth, though widely disseminated, stands as a prime example of how human bias and the appeal of a clear-cut explanation can overshadow the nuanced, often uncomfortable, truth of history. The popular version of this story is devastatingly effective. It offers a singular culprit, a definitive moment of destruction, and a chillingly logical justification for the loss of countless texts. If they contradict the Quran, they are heretical. If they agree, they are superfluous. You imagine the roaring fires, the smoke carrying the ashes of ancient wisdom. This narrative, compelling in its tragedy and moral clarity, has become deeply ingrained in popular culture, However, historical records tell a very different story. The evidence suggests that this dramatic account first appears approximately 600 years after the Arab conquest of Alexandria. Earlier and more reliable historical accounts, including those from Arab historians contemporary with the conquest, make no mention whatsoever of such an order from Caliph Omar or the destruction of the library in 641 CE. This significant absence in primary sources is a powerful indicator that the story is, in all likelihood, a fabrication. You realize that a silence spanning centuries of historical record is far louder than a dramatic anecdote appearing long after the fact. By 641 CE, when the Arab conquest occurred, the Library of Alexandria, in any meaningful sense as the vast repository of ancient knowledge, was already long gone. You recall its multi-century decline, battered by Caesar's fire in the harbour, which didn't confirm the main library's destruction, starved by decreasing imperial support, assaulted by Christian mobs who destroyed the Serapeum in 391 CE, and withered by neglect, apathy, and the relentless forces of humidity and insects. The burning of knowledge had been a slow, protracted process, not a singular, decisive event at the hands of the Arab conquerors. You understand now why this myth, despite its historical inaccuracies, held such seductive power. It provided a clear narrative framework to explain an otherwise complex and uncomfortable loss. It allowed for blame to be neatly placed, sometimes serving to demonize an other culture or to simplify the multifaceted reasons behind a civilization's failure to preserve its own wisdom. The appeal of a story too good to be true often lies in its ability to offer simple answers to profoundly complex questions. The reality, far less dramatic, is also far more sobering. The Library of Alexandria wasn't annihilated in one night, by one fire. It died slowly, across centuries, as a civilization stopped caring about preserving knowledge. That's the real tragedy. Not dramatic destruction, but gradual abandonment. And this profound reflection leaves you with a critical question for today. What seductive stories, what convenient myths are you allowing to obscure the complex truths of your own time? What knowledge are you failing to preserve, not in a blaze, but in the quiet, insidious embrace of a narrative that is simply too easy to believe? You hold it carefully, an imagined fragment of papyrus, rescued from the clutches of time and oblivion. You feel the rough texture, seeing the indelible stain of ancient ink, a few precious words from a text that miraculously survived. This fragment is not just a remnant, it is a profound testament to what did endure from the Library of Alexandria, defying the myth of total destruction. It's a physical reminder that amidst the sweeping loss, pockets of knowledge found sanctuary, carried forward by dedicated hands and a persistent human desire to preserve wisdom. You have journeyed through the complex, often contradictory, history of the library's demise, dismantling the seductive narrative of a single catastrophic fire. You now understand that Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, while causing damage to harbour warehouses, did not confirm the destruction of the main Mouseion library, which Strabo documented as functioning decades later. You witnessed the definitive, religiously motivated destruction of the Serapeum daughter library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus. But the most pervasive cause of loss, you realize, was gradual decline through decreasing imperial support, Christian hostility toward pagan learning, the empire's general instability, and the relentless, silent war against humidity, insects, and human apathy. The story of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE, you now know, is largely a fabrication, appearing centuries after the library was effectively gone. Yet, despite this multifaceted tragedy, this rescued fragment whispers of survival. You understand that the Library of Alexandria didn't exist in a vacuum. Many of its pivotal texts were duplicated, copies existing in other great centers of learning. You picture scholars, perhaps fleeing Alexandria as the city's intellectual life withered, carrying with them what precious scrolls they could. These scattered seeds of knowledge found new ground in places like Constantinople, Athens, or later within the burgeoning intellectual centers of the Islamic world. It is here that you truly appreciate the indelible stain of ink on this fragment. Islamic scholars from the 8th century onwards embarked on a monumental translation movement. You imagine their diligent work in Baghdad and other cities, meticulously translating Greek texts of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy into Arabic. Without their dedication, much of what you know today of classical thought might have been permanently lost. They didn't just preserve, they built upon, enriching and extending ancient wisdom. Similarly, Byzantine scholars in the Eastern Roman Empire maintained their own vibrant traditions, meticulously copying and preserving numerous Greek works in parchment codices. You perceive their quiet, sustained effort, safeguarding a significant portion of ancient literature and philosophy through centuries of upheaval. These parallel streams of preservation ensured that the light of ancient learning, though diminished, was never entirely extinguished. This fragment, then, represents the resilience of human knowledge and the enduring commitment of individuals and cultures to salvage it from the precipice of oblivion. While we will never know the full extent of what was permanently lost, the unique copies, the undocumented insights, the works that existed nowhere else, this small, rescued piece of papyrus, with its indelible ink, is a testament to the powerful counter-narrative of survival. It reminds you that even in the face of profound loss, the human spirit, through diligent preservation and intellectual exchange, can ensure that wisdom, in some form, finds a way to endure. You feel it now, a subtle chill tracing its way up your spine, the unsettling sensation of how lost knowledge haunts the modern world. It's not a ghost you can see, but a void you can almost perceive, the absence of ideas, of discoveries, of perspectives that simply vanished with the Library of Alexandria's complex and protracted demise. You've walked through the echoes of its destruction, dispelling the romanticized myth of a single catastrophic burning, and now you confront the profound, enduring impact of what was truly lost. The journey through documented historical evidence has shown you that the library wasn't destroyed in one dramatic fire. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE likely burned harbour warehouses, not the main Mouseion library. The definitive Christian destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE under Patriarch Theophilus was a deliberate act of religious persecution, but still not the end of the entire intellectual heritage. The true tragedy, you realize, was a slow, agonizing process of neglect, decreasing imperial support, political instability, and a profound cultural shift away from pagan Greek learning. The story of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE, you now understand, is a myth fabricated centuries later. The burning wasn't one event. It was a civilization losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. And the consequences of this slow abandonment still ripple through your world today. You recall the sheer scale of the library's collection, 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and history from across the known world. Texts by Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Sophocles, Sappho, many unique copies that existed nowhere else. When the library declined, these didn't burn in flames. They rotted from neglect, were discarded as paganism, or were simply lost as scribes stopped copying them. How does this haunt you? you perceive the countless what-ifs in the trajectory of human progress. What astronomical calculations were lost, delaying humanity's understanding of the cosmos? What medical procedures, once documented, had to be painfully rediscovered millennia later? What mathematical proofs, philosophical insights, or literary masterpieces might have fundamentally altered the course of human thought, empathy, or technological advancement, but simply vanished without a trace? The chilling reality is that you will never know. The very questions you are asking today might have been answered 2,000 years ago. While some Alexandria texts survived through copies in other libraries, diligently preserved by Islamic and Byzantine scholars, and later rediscovered during the Renaissance, you are left with the undeniable presence of absence. Much was permanently lost, setting human knowledge back centuries. It's a phantom limb, an entire branch of intellectual evolution that was severed. The true legacy of Alexandria's complex demise is not merely the destruction of a building, but the haunting realization that knowledge is incredibly fragile. It requires constant, active preservation, sustained patronage, and a collective commitment to intellectual freedom. When a civilization stops caring about its wisdom, the loss isn't just to the past. It directly impacts your present and limits your future. The chilling sensation of lost knowledge haunts the modern world as a reminder. The greatest intellectual tragedies are often silent, gradual, and born of indifference. And it leaves you with a profound, urgent question. What knowledge are you, in your own time, failing to preserve today? What will future generations mourn that you let slip away, not in a blaze, but through neglect? You stand in a vast, climate-controlled room, the anxious whir of 1,000 server farm cooling fans filling the air. You feel the constant artificial chill designed to protect countless terabytes of data, perceive the faint metallic scent of ozone, the low hum of electricity that pulses through racks of blinking lights. This, you realize, is a modern-day Alexandria, your generation's colossal repository of knowledge, a digital library seemingly impervious to the ancient threats of fire and flood. Yet the lessons from that ancient city echo here, a quiet, unsettling hum beneath the technological roar. You've journeyed through the complex history of the Library of Alexandria, dismantling the pervasive myth of a single catastrophic burning. You know now that Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE was likely harbour damage, not the obliteration of the main Mouseion library. You recall the undeniable Christian destruction of the Serapeum Daughter Library in 391 CE, a deliberate act of religious intolerance. But the most insidious killer, you've learned, was a slow, agonizing process of decreasing imperial support, political instability, shifting cultural priorities, and the relentless, silent war against humidity, insects, and human apathy. The story of Caliph Omar burning the library in 641 CE, you now understand, is a fabrication, appearing centuries after the library was already effectively gone. The burning wasn't one event. It was a civilization losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. This sobering reality carries a profound message for you, standing amidst your digital archives. You may no longer contend with fragile papyrus or the threat of a single, raging inferno, but the fundamental vulnerabilities of knowledge persist. Digital rot, obsolete file formats, server failures, cyber attacks, the sheer volume of data making curation impossible, and perhaps most critically, a collective loss of interest in what truly matters. These are your modern equivalents of Alexandria's ancient threats. You feel the immense weight of what was lost then. 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, unique copies of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Sophocles, Sappho. These works didn't burn in flames, they rotted from neglect, were discarded as paganism, or were simply lost as scribes stopped copying them. The cultural impact was immeasurable, setting human knowledge back centuries. Some survived, yes, through the diligent efforts of Islamic and Byzantine scholars, but much was permanently lost, leaving you with tantalizing gaps in your understanding of the past. The anxiety and the whir of these server fans, then, is a visceral reminder. Even with advanced technology, the core challenge of preservation remains profoundly human. It's not just about data storage, it's about active curation, continuous investment, and a sustained collective will to value and safeguard intellectual heritage. The lesson from Alexandria is clear. Knowledge is fragile. It can be lost, not just through dramatic destruction, but through subtle neglect, through shifting societal values, and through the quiet, insidious creep of indifference. It leaves you with a pressing question. What knowledge are you, in your own meticulously cooled data centers, failing to preserve today? What will future generations mourn that you let slip away through neglect, lost not in a blaze, but in the anxious whir of unattended progress? You feel it now, the unsettling weightlessness of your modern world's knowledge, an unbearable lightness of digital memory. It's the phantom touch of countless bytes, seemingly eternal, yet precariously perched on fragile technological platforms. You've journeyed through the intricate history of the Library of Alexandria's decline, dismantling the myth of a single catastrophic burning. And now you stand at the precipice of a new, equally profound realization. Your own digital age, for all its advancements, faces analogous and perhaps even more insidious threats to its accumulated wisdom. The romanticized myth of a single, dramatic fire, often pinning blame on Julius Caesar, provided a tidy explanation for a monumental loss. But you now understand the nuanced reality. Alexandria's library died slowly through decreasing imperial support, Christian destruction of the Serapeum, political instability, and most pervasively, the silent erosion of neglect and apathy over centuries. The burning was a civilization losing interest in preserving its own wisdom. You consider the profound irony as you contemplate your vast digital archives. You've moved beyond fragile papyrus, seemingly escaping the threats of humidity, insects, and physical fires. Yet, new vulnerabilities emerge. You perceive the unsettling reality of link rot, where countless web pages vanish into the digital ether. You grasp the threat of format obsolescence as older files become unreadable by newer software, effectively locking away information behind technological barriers. You contemplate the fragility of massive server farms, susceptible to power outages, cyber attacks, or even the subtle corrosion of a single, undetected hardware failure. The very speed and volume of digital creation make comprehensive curation and long-term preservation an overwhelming, often neglected task. The ghost of Alexandria whispers a chilling question through the blinking lights of your data centers. What happens when a civilization, overwhelmed by its own information, stops caring enough to curate, migrate, and actively preserve it? What unique insights, born on fleeting social media, obscure blogs, or outdated databases, are silently disappearing even now? The answer is as unsettling as the missing texts of antiquity. You will never know. Just as the Alexandrian scrolls rotted from neglect, your digital archives can become inaccessible, effectively burned through technological apathy and a lack of sustained, conscious effort. You realize that the Library of Alexandria's true legacy is not just the specific texts that were lost, but the timeless warning it provides about the fragility of human knowledge. The shift from physical scrolls to digital bytes has changed the nature of the threat, but not its fundamental reality. Preservation remains a continuous, active struggle, demanding constant investment and a collective societal will. The unbearable lightness of digital memory, then, becomes a profound metaphor. Knowledge, in its ethereal digital form, feels weightless, easily replicated, seemingly immortal. But this very ease can breed complacency, masking the immense human effort and resources required for its true long-term survival. The lesson from Alexandria resonates with renewed urgency. Your generation, too, faces the choice of whether to actively value and fight for its accumulated wisdom, or to let it slip away, not in a blaze, but in the silent, invisible dissolution of neglected digital archives.